Before we begin, take a moment to drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos, because what we are about to explore together is one of the most overlooked, most unsettling, and most genuinely important chapters in the entire story of human survival. This is not a monster movie. This is not a fantasy. What you are about to hear is rooted in fossil evidence, ecological science, and the cold, hard logic of what it meant to be a small, vulnerable, early human living in one of the most dangerous landscapes this planet has ever produced. So settle in, because the story of Dinopithecus, the giant baboon that walked alongside our earliest ancestors, is a story that reaches across millions of years and lands directly at the foundation of everything we are today. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself loudly. It does not come with dramatic music or flashing lights. It settles in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground at the end of a long afternoon. It is the fear of something large, something intelligent, something territorial, watching you from across a wedge of a rocky ridge, and you do not know whether it will move toward you or away. That fear, that slow and suffocating kind of dread, daily feature of life for some of the earliest members of our own lineage. And the creature responsible for a significant portion of that dread was not a leopard, not a hyena, not a saber-toothed cat. It was something far more unsettling, because it was something far more familiar. It was a primate. It walked on 4 legs but could stand tall. It had a face that was recognizable, with deep-set eyes capable of reading intention and emotion. It lived in groups, communicated with complex vocalizations, remembered enemies, formed alliances, held grudges, and defended territory with a ferocity that could leave even large predators thinking twice. It was called Dinopithecus, and for hundreds of thousands of years, it was one of the most formidable biological forces operating in the landscapes of early South Africa. We tend to tell the story of human evolution as a story of triumph, and in the broadest sense it is. We are here. That alone is remarkable. But the details of how we got here, the grinding, uncertain, generation-by-generation reality of early hominin survival, are far less triumphant than the headlines suggest. For every early human group that made it through a dry season, found water, raised offspring to reproductive age, and passed their genes forward into the next chapter of our shared story, there were others that did not. There were groups erased by drought, groups taken by leopards in the night, groups pushed away from critical food sources by competitors larger and stronger than themselves. Groups that simply ran out of time in a landscape that offered no guarantees and showed no favoritism. The early Plio-Pleistocene of South Africa was not a world designed for human success. It was a world designed for nothing at all, just a churning ecological system in which every species was fighting for purchase, every adaptation was being tested, and every moment of stability was temporary. Into that world, Dinopithecus like a key into a lock. Large, powerful, socially sophisticated, and deeply embedded in the landscape, baboon-like primate occupied much of the same ecological space that early hominins were desperately trying to claim. They drank from the same sources. They sheltered in the same rocky outcroppings and cave-adjacent cliff faces. They competed for the same seasonal fruit, the same roots, the same safe sleeping sites above the reach of ground-level predators. And they did all of this with bodies that were, by almost any physical measure, dramatically better equipped for that competition than those of the small, bipedal hominins scrambling around them. Understanding Dinopithecus, therefore, is not an exercise in prehistoric curiosity. It is an exercise in understanding the actual conditions under which human intelligence, human social behavior, and human survival strategy were forged. It is understanding the crucible. And to understand the crucible, you have to first understand the heat. Let us begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as our fossil record allows. The early Plio-Pleistocene epoch, stretching roughly from about 3.5 million years ago to somewhere around 1.5 million years ago, was a period of extraordinary biological activity across the African continent. The climate was shifting, forests were contracting, grasslands were expanding. River systems were changing their courses. Lakes were forming and disappearing on timescales measured in tens of thousands of years rather than the millions we sometimes imagine. The planet was in the middle of one of its great reorganizations, and every living creature on the African landscape was being pushed, pulled, sorted, and selected by forces far beyond any individual animal's ability to perceive or resist. In South Africa specifically, this period produced one of the richest and most complex fossil records anywhere in the world. The caves and ancient lake beds and rocky hillsides of what we now call the cradle of humankind have yielded bones and teeth and stone tools that allow scientists to reconstruct, in broad strokes, the extraordinary community of creatures that lived, competed, and died in this region during that formative time. Among those creatures, species of early hominins, are direct and near-direct ancestors. Australopithecus africanus was there, small-brained but upright, navigating the landscape on two legs with a degree of skill that was genuinely impressive given how recently their lineage had committed to bipedalism. Paranthropus robustus was there as well, the heavily built, massive-jawed branch of the hominin family that would eventually go extinct while our own line continued. Early forms of Homo were beginning to appear, creatures whose brain cases were slightly larger, whose tool use was slightly more sophisticated, whose social arrangements were perhaps slightly more complex. But none of these creatures were dominant, none of them sat at the top of any hierarchy, all of them were prey items for something, all of them were competitors with something else, all of them were, in the most fundamental biological sense of the word, vulnerable. And among the creatures that made them vulnerable, among the species that shaped their behavior and their movement and their choices from day to day and season to season, was Dinopithecus ingens, a name that, when translated from the Greek and Latin roots that scientists gave it, means something along the lines of terrible or fearsome ape of enormous size. The name was given by Scottish paleontologist Robert Broom in 1937, and while the classification has been subject to revision and debate in the decades since, the core reality of what Dinopithecus was remains striking. This was a baboon, or something very closely related to the baboon lineage, but scaled up to a degree that strains the modern imagination. Where the largest male olive baboons alive today might reach weights of around 40 to 50 kilograms, Dinopithecus ingens appears to have been significantly larger, with some estimates placing adult males in the range of 80 kilograms or more. That is a body mass roughly equivalent to human male, but packaged in a form built not for tool use or long-distance running, but for raw physical confrontation, with a jaw structure capable of delivering crushing force, with canine teeth of a size that modern baboons already use to devastating effect in disputes with predators. And with the upper body strength of an animal that spent significant time climbing, and that needed to be capable of defending itself and its group against the full range of predators operating in its environment. Imagine something like a very large, powerfully built baboon, the kind that already looks intimidating in its modern form, and then scale it up, add weight, add muscle, sharpen the canines, broaden the skull, and place it in the middle of a landscape where everything was competing for survival. That is Dinopithecus, and that is what early hominins were sharing space with. The fossil record for Dinopithecus is, as we will explore in much greater detail later in this documentary, frustratingly incomplete. What we have is largely crania and teeth, the parts of an animal's body that are most likely to survive the processes of fossilization simply because they are the densest and hardest. From these cranial remains and dental evidence, scientists have been able to make a number of important inferences about the animal's size, its diet, its taxonomic relationships to other primates, and the approximate timeframe of its existence. But the postcranial skeletons of the body below the neck remains largely a mystery. We do not have good evidence for what Dinopithecus looked like when it moved, how it carried its enormous body weight across the landscape, whether it was more terrestrial or more arboreal in its habits than modern baboons, or precisely how it interacted physically with the other species around it. What we have, in essence, is the face and the teeth of a giant. The rest must be inferred from what we know about its closest living relatives and from the general ecological principles that govern large, socially complex primates. That inferential process is not guesswork. It is grounded in a rich understanding of modern baboon behavior, ecology, and social organization, an understanding built over decades of field observation by some of the most dedicated primatologists in the history of science. And what modern baboon ecology tells us when applied to a creature of Dinopithecus's scale is genuinely sobering. Modern baboons are already remarkable animals. They are opportunistic omnivores capable of hunting prey as large as small antelope. They live in complex social groups with well-defined hierarchies, long-term social bonds, and sophisticated communication systems. They are capable of learning from experience in ways that allow them to navigate novel challenges with a degree of flexibility that surprised early researchers. They can be extraordinarily aggressive when threatened or when competing for resources. Large male baboons have been documented killing adult leopards under certain circumstances. They mob predators as a coordinated group. They remember which individuals of their own species and others have behaved threateningly toward them, and they adjust their responses accordingly. In the modern African savanna, baboons are not prey items to be trifled with. They are significant ecological players in their own right. Now take all of that and double the size. The implications for early hominins sharing a landscape with Dinopithecus become immediately clear. This was not simply a matter of occasionally crossing paths with a large, unfriendly neighbor. This was a matter of existing in constant negotiation with a creature that was potentially capable of outcompeting early humans for nearly every critical resource those early humans needed, and that had the physical tools to enforce that competitive advantage through direct confrontation if necessary. Food sources, water sources, sleeping sites, travel routes, all of these could be affected by the presence or the territorial preferences of a Dinopithecus troop, and for a small hominin group, the calculus of how to respond to that pressure was not simple. Confront the troop directly, almost certainly suicidal for any group lacking numerical superiority and sufficient physical intimidation. Avoid the territory entirely. That might mean abandoning access to water during a dry season, which carried its own potentially lethal consequences. Find another route, another water source, another sleeping site. In a landscape already crowded with competing species, alternatives were not always available. This is the structural reality of the threat that Dinopithecus represented. It was not a predator lurking in the shadows, waiting to ambush and consume early humans. It was something in some ways more insidious, a competitor of roughly equivalent ecological needs but vastly superior physical capabilities, whose presence could gradually, steadily, and invisibly squeeze the margins of survival for hominin groups operating in the same habitat. Every territory claimed by a Dinopithecus troop was territory that was effectively off-limits, or at least extremely costly for hominins to enter. Every resource monopolized by these giant primates was a resource that early humans had to find elsewhere or go without. And in an environment where margins were already thin, in a climate that was already unpredictable, in a landscape already populated by enough carnivores to make nighttime exposure genuinely terrifying, the additional pressure of Dinopithecus was a pressure that shaped behavior in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. To truly understand the world in which Dinopithecus and early hominins interacted, we need to spend some time inhabiting that world imaginatively, because the data alone, presented as dry scientific fact, cannot convey the texture of life in early South Africa in the way that a more immersive understanding can. Science gives us the framework, but the framework has to be populated with lived experience before it becomes truly meaningful. Picture the landscape of the cradle of humankind region roughly 2.5 million years ago. The modern high-altitude grasslands, the manicured game reserves, the tourist centers and museum complexes, none of these exist. What exists instead is a landscape in transition, neither fully forested nor fully open, but a mosaic of habitats that shifts from one to the next across relatively short distances. Riverine woodland lines the courses of seasonal rivers, dense enough that the canopy provides real shade and real cover, filled with the kinds of fruit-bearing trees that primates of all kinds depended on for significant portions of their diet during certain seasons of the year. Beyond the river corridors, the vegetation opens into more mixed woodland and bush, scrubby and irregular, providing cover for ambush predators and scattered food resources for foragers willing to move carefully through it. Farther out still, the landscape opens into more exposed grassland, where the visibility is better but the cover is less and the distances from water are greater. The seasons are not the neat, predictable cycles we might imagine. Rainfall is variable. Droughts come without warning and last longer than any individual animal can prepare for. A dry season that should last 3 months stretches into 5, and the rivers that normally provide reliable water shrink to isolated pools and then to nothing but cracked mud with scattered hoof prints and the bones of animals that did not move away in time. Then the rains return, sometimes with violent intensity, flooding the low-lying areas and temporarily recharging the system. Everything blooms and fruits rapidly in the immediate aftermath of the rains, and the landscape becomes briefly abundant before settling back into the grind of the next season's scarcity. For every living creature in this landscape, every primate, every carnivore, every ungulate, every reptile, the fundamental challenge of existence is matching the timing of your movements, your reproduction, your foraging behavior, and your social arrangements to the rhythms of this highly variable system. Miss the timing and the consequences can be immediate and severe. Into this landscape, place your cast of characters. The leopards are there, solitary, almost invisible, capable of killing prey several times their own body weight and carrying it into trees to feed in safety away from the hyenas and lions that would otherwise steal the kill. The leopard is perhaps the single most significant direct predator pressure on early hominins, because unlike lions, which tend to hunt in more open areas and are more easily detected at a distance, leopards operate at the margins, in the transitional zones between forest and open ground, at night with a stealth and patience that makes them extraordinarily difficult to detect before it is too late. Leopards also, critically, are quite capable of killing and consuming large baboons, which means that both Dinopithecus and early hominins were operating under the same leopard threat, which created complex patterns of mutual influence in terms of where each species chose to sleep when they chose to move, and how they positioned themselves relative to rocky outcroppings and trees that might provide some elevation-based safety from ground-level ambush. The hyenas are there as well in larger and more diverse forms than the spotted hyenas we know today, including some species considerably larger and more powerful, capable of cracking bones that would defeat the jaws of their modern descendants. Hyenas are not simply scavengers. They are efficient hunters capable of running down prey over long distances, and they operate in the half-light of dawn and dusk as well as through the night. For any hominin group trying to move between sleeping sites and foraging areas during the transitional periods of early morning or late afternoon, the times that should, ecologically speaking, offer some relief from the heat of midday, the hyena threat was a real and present concern. And for any hominin group that had made a kill, however small, or that had access to any kind of high-calorie food resource, the presence of hyenas meant that holding onto that resource was a constant challenge. There are giant pigs, creatures like Metrodiochirus and related forms that were far larger and more dangerous than their modern relatives, rooting through the vegetation at the forest edge. There are diverse antelopes in the grassland, providing the prey base that supports the carnivore community and that early hominins may have opportunistically scavenged from when the chance arose. There are crocodiles in the permanent water sources. There are enormous birds of prey, some species large enough to have taken hominin infants, as the fossil evidence suggests. There are snakes, there are monitor lizards capable of delivering serious injury. The landscape is not a parade of dangers, not every animal a predator, not every moment a crisis, but the density of significant threats is high enough that inattention or poor decision-making could have fatal consequences on any given day. And in the middle of all of this, moving through the landscape in their large, coordinated, formidably powerful troops, are the Dinopithecus. They are loud, baboons are loud animals, and a large troop of giant baboons moving through riverine woodland would have been audible from a considerable distance, a fact that early hominins probably learned to use as a kind of early warning system for the troop's location. They are social. The complex vocal and gestural communication of a baboon troop is constant, a running commentary of social negotiation, alarm calls, comfort calls, and dominance assertions. They are territorial in the sense that they have defined home ranges and will defend access to critical resources within those ranges. And they are, when threatened or when competing for something they want, capable of collective aggression that would have been genuinely dangerous for any species that challenged them directly. The question of how early hominins actually experienced the presence of Dinopithecus in their environment is one that the fossil record cannot answer directly. We do not have diary entries. We do not have behavioral observations recorded by some ancient field researcher. What we have is a combination of physical evidence, the fossils of both species found in overlapping locations and time periods, and the inferential toolkit provided by our understanding of how similar species interact in modern ecosystems. From these two sources, combined with careful ecological reasoning, we can begin to construct a picture of what that daily experience might have looked like. For a small hominin group, and early hominin groups almost certainly were small, probably not much larger than the band sizes we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies, perhaps somewhere between 20 and 60 individuals depending on the local resource base, the awareness of a Dinopithecus troop in the area would have been continuous and would have shaped nearly every significant decision the group made. Where to sleep at night was perhaps the most critical decision. Good sleeping sites in early South Africa were not randomly distributed. They required elevation, enough height above the ground to reduce the accessibility of leopards and other ground-level predators. They required some form of structural protection, a cave entrance, a rocky overhang, a dense tangle of vegetation around a large tree that made surprise approach difficult. And they required reasonable proximity to water and food sources, because a sleeping site so remote from resources that the group had to travel far through exposed terrain every morning and evening to reach food and water was trading one risk for another. These sleeping sites were, in other words, premium real estate, and the same logic that made them valuable to early hominins made them equally valuable to Dinopithecus. A large troop of Dinopithecus settling into a rocky outcropping or a cave-adjacent cliff face for the night represented a permanent occupation of that site for as long as the troop remained in the area. The noise of a large baboon troop settling down for the night, the calling, the squabbling, the social sorting that occurs as individuals find their positions, would have been immediately recognizable to any hominin group within earshot. And the implication would have been just as immediately clear: this site is occupied, do not approach. The decision of where to sleep then was not simply a matter of finding a good site. It was a matter of finding a good site that was not already being used or claimed by something more powerful. For early hominins in a landscape populated by both Dinopithecus troops and leopards and hyenas, the geometry of this problem was genuinely difficult. Good sites occupied by Dinopithecus were inaccessible. Good sites not occupied by Dinopithecus were potentially accessible to leopards or hyenas. Sites far enough from everything threatening might be safe from large predators and competing primates, but were potentially too remote from water or food to sustain the group through a dry season. There was no perfect answer. Every sleeping site was a compromise. Every night was a negotiation between different categories of risk. This is the kind of environmental pressure that, over hundreds of thousands of years, applied consistently to generation after generation of early hominin populations, selects for specific cognitive and behavioral traits. Not tools, not fire, at least not yet. Those technological solutions were still in the future. What this pressure selected for in these early periods was something more fundamental: the capacity to remember, to map, to anticipate, and to adjust. The capacity to build a detailed internal model of the landscape: who lives where, what resources are available in what locations, how those resources change across seasons, which routes are safe at which times of day, which competitors are in which areas, which predators are most active at dawn versus dusk. This kind of sophisticated spatial and social memory, applied to a complex and dynamic environment, is one of the foundational cognitive building blocks of what would eventually become human intelligence. And Dinopithecus, as one of the most powerful and consistent sources of environmental pressure on early hominin populations, was one of the sculptors of that intelligence. It is worth pausing here to address a misconception that sometimes enters discussions of prehistoric human-animal interactions, and that can distort our understanding of what creatures like Dinopithecus actually meant for our ancestors. The misconception is the idea that early hominins were helpless victims, passive recipients of whatever the environment chose to do to them, incapable of meaningful response. This picture is both inaccurate and, in its own way, condescending to the real cognitive and social capabilities of our early ancestors. Early hominins were not helpless. They were small and physically vulnerable relative to many of the creatures in their environment, yes, but they were also socially sophisticated, capable of group coordination, capable of learning from experience, and capable of passing learned knowledge to subsequent generations. They were not simply reacting. They were, in their own way, strategizing. The evidence for this comes from multiple directions. The stone tools that begin appearing in the archaeological record around 2.5 million years ago, simple but effective flaked stone implements that could be used to butcher carcasses, process plant materials, or create sharp edges for various purposes, represent not just technological achievement but social achievement. The knowledge of how to make these tools had to be transmitted from individual to individual, from generation to generation. That transmission required communication, demonstration, attention, and memory. It required something like teaching. And the presence of these tools in the archaeological record tells us that early hominins were capable of exactly that kind of social learning and knowledge transmission. Similarly, the patterns of how early hominins moved through the landscape, reconstructed through the spatial distribution of fossil finds, stone tool scatters, and evidence of resource use, suggests strategic planning rather than random wandering. Groups appear to have made deliberate choices about when to move and where to go, tracking seasonal resources, returning to productive sites across multiple seasons, establishing patterns of movement that reflect accumulated knowledge of the landscape rather than simple reactive foraging. These are not the behavior patterns of animals without cognitive agency. These are the behavior patterns of creatures that, while not yet fully human in the cognitive sense, we're already well along the path toward the kind of environmental intelligence that would eventually define our species. But acknowledging early hominin cognitive capability does not diminish the challenge that Dinopithecus represented. In fact, it sharpens it. Because the more sophisticated we understand early hominins to have been, the more clearly we can see that the strategies they would have developed to deal with Dinopithecus were exactly the kinds of strategies that built the cognitive architecture of modern human intelligence. Avoidance required map-making. Coordination required communication. Response to alarm required shared attention. Seasonal adjustment of movement patterns required temporal memory. Every cognitive demand placed on early hominin groups by the presence of powerful competitors like Dinopithecus was a demand that, over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated neural machinery for meeting that demand. Now let us turn to the ecological context in more detail, because Dinopithecus did not exist in isolation, and neither did early hominins. The community of creatures sharing the early South African landscape was extraordinarily complex, and understanding the full picture of that community is essential to appreciating exactly what early hominins were up against and exactly what role Dinopithecus played within that larger system. The early South African ecosystem of the Plio-Pleistocene was, in ecological terms, what scientists call a high-diversity, high-competition community. It was not simply that there were many species present, though there were. It was that the ecological roles within that community were occupied by multiple competing species, each of them well adapted to their particular niche, but also flexible enough to encroach on neighboring niches when opportunity or necessity demanded. This kind of community structure creates intense competitive pressure across the board. Every species is, to some degree, in competition with multiple other species simultaneously. There is no clear, unchallenged ecological path for any single species. Every resource base is contested. Every niche has neighbors pressing in from multiple sides. For early hominins, this meant operating as a middle-tier species, neither the apex predator nor the prey animal that simply feeds and hopes not to be eaten, but something in between. They were potential prey for the large carnivores. They were competitors with other primates, including Dinopithecus, for plant foods and sleeping sites. They were occasional scavengers of the kills made by large carnivores, which put them in direct competition with hyenas and vultures and other scavengers. They were, in other words, simultaneously playing multiple ecological roles, none of which was unchallenged, all of which carried risk. The large carnivore guild of early South Africa was formidable. Leopards, as already discussed, were perhaps the most significant direct predator threat for hominins specifically. But the guild also included lions, larger forms of lion than exist today, operating in pride structures that gave them significant power in open areas. It included various species of saber-toothed cats, members of the genus Meganthurion and Dinopithecus among others, animals whose extreme canine development suggests they were specialized for taking large prey through ambush and deep puncture wounds. Dinopithecus in particular has been the subject of considerable scientific discussion regarding its possible role as a hominin predator, with some fossil sites suggesting regular association between Dinopithecus and hominin remains that goes beyond coincidence. There were also wild dogs, large, efficient pack hunters capable of running prey to exhaustion over long distances, and various forms of hyena beyond the spotted form we know today, including the enormous Pachycrocuta, sometimes called the giant short-faced hyena, which may have been the largest hyena that ever lived and was certainly capable of cracking bones that would have baffled its modern relatives. This carnivore guild, taken collectively, represents a predator pressure of staggering intensity. For any small primate navigating this landscape, the margin for error in terms of predator avoidance was extremely thin. Now layer onto this carnivore pressure the competitive pressure from other primates. Dinopithecus was the largest, but it was not the only competitor. Other cercopithecid primates, various forms of colobines and other papillonins, were present in the landscape, occupying slightly different niches, but overlapping enough with early hominin resource use to create additional competitive friction. The primate community of early South Africa was diverse and competitive, and early hominins were neither the largest nor the most numerous members of that community. They were relatively modest players in a very crowded field. In this context, the specific advantages that early hominins possessed take on a new significance. Bipedalism, while not the fastest or most powerful mode of locomotion in the short term, allowed sustained travel over long distances in a way that most quadrupedal competitors could not match. This meant that early hominins could, when necessary, simply outrange their competitors, moving farther from water sources than a Dinopithecus troop might comfortably travel, accessing food patches in areas that were too remote for regular use by more water-dependent species. It also freed the hands for carrying, for manipulation, for the eventual use of tools, advantages that were slow to manifest fully, but that were accumulating steadily in their adaptive potential. Social communication was another key advantage, though one that was shared to varying degrees with Dinopithecus. The ability to share information within a group, to signal the location of food, to warn of approaching predators, to coordinate group movement, was not unique to hominins, but the form it took in our ancestors was beginning to evolve towards something more complex than what other primates possessed. The early evolution of language, or the proto-linguistic communication systems that preceded true language, was almost certainly driven in significant part by the demands of navigating a complex, competitive, predator-rich environment in which information sharing could be the difference between survival and extinction. And then there was the capacity for cumulative cultural learning, the ability not just to learn from experience individually, but to accumulate knowledge across generations in a way that allowed each generation to start from a slightly more advanced position than the last. This is the capacity that ultimately makes humans so distinctive as a species. It is the foundation of everything from stone tools to agriculture to written language to the documentary you are watching right now. And it was being built piece by incremental piece in the pressure-filled, competition-saturated landscapes of early South Africa, shaped in part by the demands of coexisting with creatures like Dinopithecus. The timeline of Dinopithecus's existence is worth examining carefully because it overlaps in important ways with key transitions in our own evolutionary history. The fossil evidence places Dinopithecus ingens most confidently in the period between roughly 3 million and 1.5 million years ago, though the precise boundaries of this range remain subject to ongoing research and revision. This timeframe encompasses some of the most significant developments in human evolutionary history. It spans the period during which the genus Homo first appears in the fossil record. It covers the development and spread of the Alduin stone tool tradition, the earliest formalized stone tool technology. It includes periods of significant climate change that drove dramatic shifts in vegetation cover and resource availability across the African continent, and it sees the emergence of the first forms of Homo that were beginning to look, in some meaningful ways, something like us. The fact that Dinopithecus was present throughout this entire period, or at least a significant portion of it, is not coincidental in the sense that there is any simple, direct causal relationship between Dinopithecus's presence and these hominin developments. Evolution is not that simple, but it is meaningful in the sense that Dinopithecus was part of the environmental context within which these developments unfolded. It was one of the constant features of the landscape during a period of extraordinary evolutionary change, and as one of the most formidable non-carnivore competitors that early hominins faced, it was certainly one of the factors shaping the selective environment that drove those changes. Consider, for example, the development of stone tools. The Alduin tradition, named for the Olduvai Gorge site in Tanzania where many early examples were found, represents a genuinely significant cognitive and behavioral development. Making a useful stone flake requires understanding of fracture mechanics, selection of appropriate raw materials, deliberate application of force in a specific direction and at a specific angle, and the ability to recognize and correct mistakes in the flaking process. None of this is cognitively simple. And while the Alduin tools themselves may look crude to modern eyes accustomed to the full sweep of human technological history, they represented a significant advance in the ability to process food, particularly in the ability to access the meat and marrow of large animal carcasses that early hominins encountered either as scavenged kills or, increasingly, as hunted prey. Now think about what that technological capacity meant in the context of a landscape occupied by Dinopithecus. One of the resources that early hominins and Dinopithecus competed for was high-quality food, protein-rich, calorie-dense food that could sustain individuals and groups through periods of scarcity. For Dinopithecus, as for modern baboons, this included animal protein obtained through opportunistic hunting of small animals and through various forms of scavenging. Early hominins with access to stone tools were increasingly capable of competing in the same protein acquisition domain, and moreover of accessing food sources, like the deep bone marrow of large carcasses, that even a creature like Dinopithecus could not easily reach without the equivalent of a butchery toolkit. In this sense, stone tools represented not just a technological advancement, but a competitive advantage relative to species like Dinopithecus. They allowed early hominins to extract value from resources that their larger competitors could not fully exploit. But this competitive advantage was not, in the early Alduin period, dramatic enough to fundamentally change the power dynamics between the two species. Early stone tools did not make hominins stronger, faster, or more intimidating. They did not protect against leopard attacks. They did not make a small hominin group capable of displacing a Dinopithecus troop from a valued sleeping site. They were, in these early stages, a subtle advantage at the margins, important, accumulating, and significant over the long sweep of evolutionary time, but not immediately transformative in terms of day-to-day competitive interactions with something like Dinopithecus. One of the most illuminating aspects of the Dinopithecus story is what it reveals about the nature of extinction. We tend to think of extinction as something that happens to animals that are poorly adapted, that extinction is, in some sense, a punishment for inadequacy. But Dinopithecus was not poorly adapted. By any measure, this was a successful, well-adapted, ecologically sophisticated species. It was large, strong, socially complex, behaviorally flexible, and deeply embedded in its environment, and yet it went extinct. The last fossil evidence of Dinopithecus dates from around 1.5 million years ago, at which point the species disappears entirely from the fossil record. What happened? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The fossil record is not complete enough, and our understanding of the environmental changes of that period is not precise enough to point to a single cause or even to confidently rank competing causes. But we can identify the major factors that were changing during the period of Dinopithecus's apparent extinction, and from these we can construct plausible scenarios. Climate change is the most obvious candidate. The period around 1.5 to 2 million years ago saw significant changes in African climate, with a general trend toward cooler and drier conditions and an increase in the variability of climate cycles. These changes drove substantial shifts in vegetation, reducing the forest and woodland habitats that large primates like Dinopithecus depended on and expanding the open grasslands. For a primate of Dinopithecus's size and dietary requirements, this kind of habitat change would have been challenging. Large body size requires large caloric input. A primate that weighs 80 kilograms needs a lot of food every day, and the food sources it depends on, fruits, seeds, roots, animal protein, become harder to find and more widely spaced in a drier, more open landscape. As habitats contract and fragment, populations become smaller and more isolated, genetic diversity decreases, the ability to adapt to further change is reduced. Eventually, populations cross below the threshold at which they can sustain themselves, and extinction follows. Competition from early Homo may have also played a role, though this is more speculative. By the period of Dinopithecus's extinction, early Homo was becoming increasingly capable, with better tools, possibly beginning to use fire, and almost certainly with more sophisticated social and communicative systems. If early Homo was increasingly effective at competing for the same resources that Dinopithecus depended on, this competitive pressure would have added to the environmental stress already being imposed by climate change. Whether this competitive pressure was significant enough to actually drive Dinopithecus to extinction, as opposed to simply being one of many factors in a complex extinction story, is something we cannot determine with the evidence currently available. What we can say is that Dinopithecus's extinction was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern of large primate extinction that unfolded across Africa during this period, a pattern that seems to reflect the combined effects of climate change, habitat loss, and the increasingly dominant ecological presence of a single remarkable primate lineage, our own. This is not a comfortable thought. The story of human success has, from the very beginning, been entangled with the story of other species' decline. That entanglement did not begin with agriculture or industrialization or the modern era. It began here, in the rocky landscapes of early South Africa, with the gradual and probably imperceptible accumulation of competitive advantage by one small, upright tool using primate over the extraordinary diversity of life that surrounded it. The fossil evidence itself deserves more careful attention because the way we know what we know about Dinopithecus is as important as the knowledge itself. The study of Dinopithecus is, in many ways, a study in the limits of paleontology, in what can be known and what must remain uncertain when the material record is as fragmentary as it is for this species. The original discovery of Dinopithecus ingens was made at the Swartkrans Cave site in the Transvaal region of South Africa, a location that has since become one of the most intensively studied paleontological sites in the world. Swartkrans has yielded fossils of multiple hominin species, various carnivores, ungulates, and primates, all of them deposited in the cave through a combination of carnivore activity, natural fall, and geological processes over a period spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The cave site is, in essence, a time capsule, an accumulation of biological material from the early Plio-Pleistocene that provides an extraordinary window into the community of creatures that lived in the region during that time. Robert Broom, who identified and named Dinopithecus ingens in 1937, was working from cranial material, a relatively complete skull that showed a primate of impressive dimensions, clearly related to the baboon lineage but substantially larger than any known living species. The naming and initial description of the species established the basic framework that subsequent researchers have worked within, revising and refining our understanding as additional material has been found and as the techniques available for analyzing fossil material have improved. Since Broom's original description, additional material attributed to Dinopithecus has been found at several other South African sites, including Kromdraai and various other cave deposits in the cradle of humankind region. But the total body of material remains limited. We are dealing with a small number of skulls, fragments, and teeth spread across a handful of sites and covering a time range of potentially over 1 million years. This is not enough material to reconstruct the full biology of the animal with the kind of confidence that scientists would prefer. There are genuine debates about how much variation in the material reflects genuine species diversity versus individual variation within a single species versus the effects of time, slightly different populations from different periods being lumped together under a single taxonomic label. The question of taxonomy, of exactly how Dinopithecus relates to other known fossil and living primates, has been particularly active in the scientific literature. Some researchers have argued that Dinopithecus ingens is so closely related to the contemporary fossil baboon Papio, or Dinopithecus quadritirostris, that the two should be considered the same genus or even the same species. Others maintain that there are sufficient differences in the cranial morphology and dental structure to justify maintaining Dinopithecus as a distinct genus. This debate is not merely academic name-calling. It has real implications for how we understand the evolutionary history of baboons, the diversity of large primates in early South Africa, and the specific ecological roles that these different primate lineages were playing in the same landscape at the same time. What is not seriously debated is the fundamental reality of a large, baboon-like primate with a body size substantially exceeding that of modern baboons living in South Africa during the early Plio-Pleistocene, and overlapping in both time and space with multiple hominin species. Whatever name we give it, whatever its precise taxonomic position relative to other papionins, the ecological reality of that creature and its implications for early hominin survival are clear. The dental evidence from Dinopithecus is particularly instructive because teeth are not just taxonomic markers, they are ecological documents. The size, shape, wear patterns, and structural characteristics of an animal's teeth tell us a great deal about what it ate, how it processed food, and therefore what ecological role it was filling in its community. For Dinopithecus, the dental evidence paints a picture of an animal that was, in dietary terms, a generalist omnivore, exactly what we would expect for a large baboon-like primate. The molars of Dinopithecus are large and well-suited for processing tough plant material, roots, rhizomes, fibrous plant stems, hard seeds. This suggests that, like modern baboons, Dinopithecus would have been capable of exploiting underground storage organs during dry seasons when more easily accessible plant foods were scarce. The ability to dig for and process root foods is a significant ecological capability because underground storage organs are often available even when surface vegetation has dried up and fruiting has ceased. This is one of the dietary strategies that allows modern baboons to survive dry seasons in habitats that would be unsustainable for more narrowly specialized frugivores. The canines of Dinopithecus, particularly in males, were large, as would be expected for an animal in which male-male competition was likely intense, and in which canine display and canine combat played important roles in social dominance hierarchies. Large canines in baboons serve multiple functions beyond simple fighting. They are weapons in confrontations with predators. They are threat displays that can deter attack. They are tools of social assertion within the troop, and they are, from the perspective of any creature that might consider challenging a male Dinopithecus, serious deterrents. a male baboon's canines today can deliver wounds that require medical attention in humans. The canines of a male Dinopithecus, substantially larger and a body substantially larger, would have been formidable weapons by any standard. The overall dental wear patterns, the patterns of scratching, pitting, and attrition on the tooth surfaces, suggest a diet that included abrasive items like underground plant material coated in grit and sand, as well as tougher items that required sustained chewing force. This pattern is consistent with a highly flexible diet that varied substantially across seasons, which in turn suggests a foraging strategy capable of adjusting to the variable resource availability of the early South African landscape. Adaptability in diet is a significant survival advantage, and it is an advantage that Dinopithecus appears to have shared with the early hominins it competed with. The facial morphology associated with the dental anatomy, the heavy brow ridges, the robust jaw architecture, the overall cranial proportions, all reflect an animal built for powerful biting. The skull of Dinopithecus is, in the appropriate technical sense of the word, impressive. It is the skull of an animal that was not just large, but that was structurally engineered for the kind of robust, forceful feeding behavior that a large omnivore in a seasonal, variable environment would need. And it is the skull of an animal whose overall physical presentation would have communicated power and capability in ways that would have been immediately legible to the early hominins sharing its landscape. Let us spend a moment considering the social structure of Dinopithecus, which, like its diet and its postcranial anatomy, must be inferred from what we know about modern baboon social organization rather than from direct fossil evidence. This inference is not arbitrary. The close phylogenetic relationship between Dinopithecus and modern baboons makes it reasonable to assume that the broad outlines of social organization were similar, even if the specific details may have differed in ways we cannot reconstruct. Modern baboon societies are organized around female philopatry. Females remain in their natal group throughout their lives, forming the stable social core of the troop, while males transfer between groups at sexual maturity. Female social relationships are complex, long-term, and hierarchically organized, with dominant females and their offspring having priority access to resources. Male rank is contested and shifting, with large males competing for high-rank positions that confer preferential access to mating opportunities and, to some extent, to food resources. The troop as a whole functions as a coordinated unit for foraging, predator detection, and defense, with alarm calls that communicate specific threat types, allowing rapid coordinated response to predator detection, and with collective mobbing behavior that can deter or even injure predators bold enough to approach the troop. For Dinopithecus, a similar social structure would mean troops organized around a core of related females, with multiple males of varying ages and ranks, and with troop sizes that could potentially be quite large. Modern baboon troops vary in size from around 20 individuals to over 200 in some highly productive habitats, with the most common sizes being somewhere in the range of 40 to 80 individuals. A Dinopithecus troop at the upper end of this size range would have been an extraordinary force in the landscape. 80 individuals of a species whose adults could weigh 80 kilograms, capable of collective action, equipped with formidable canines, and defending territory against all comers with the confidence of a group that knew, from experience, that very few things in their environment could challenge them successfully. Even at more modest troop sizes, say 30 to 40 individuals, the collective power of a Dinopithecus group would have been overwhelming relative to a small hominin band of similar or even greater numbers. The size differential between individuals would have made direct physical confrontation deeply inadvisable from the hominin perspective. And the social coordination of the Dinopithecus troop, the alarm call system, the collective defense behavior, the ability to mount coordinated responses to threats, would have made even indirect competition, such as approaching a resource site currently occupied by the troop, a risky proposition. This brings us to one of the most interesting questions in the study of early hominin-Dinopithecus interactions: whether early hominins ever observed and learned from Dinopithecus's social behavior. Modern primatologists have documented numerous instances of different primate species attending to each other's alarm calls and using the information conveyed in those calls to make decisions about their own behavior. Vervet monkeys, for example, have different alarm calls for different predator types, and other species in their habitat have been documented learning to respond appropriately to vervet alarm calls, even though those calls evolved within the vervet communication system. It is entirely plausible, Indeed, it seems quite likely given what we know about cross-species communication in modern primate communities, that early hominins paid close attention to Dinopithecus alarm calls, using the information they conveyed about the presence and location of predators to make better informed decisions about their own movements and safety. In this sense, Dinopithecus may have served as an inadvertent source of valuable ecological information for early hominins, a living alarm system whose vocalizations, properly understood, could help early humans navigate the predator-rich landscape more safely. The relationship between sleeping site selection and survival is worth exploring in more detail, because it is one of the domains in which the competition between early hominins and Dinopithecus was most direct and most consequential. For any primate in early South Africa, the transition from the active foraging period of the day to the vulnerability of the sleeping period at night represented a period of acute risk. The large carnivores, particularly leopards, were most active during the twilight and nighttime hours, and any primate caught in the open at those times was in serious danger. The solution for both Dinopithecus and early hominins was to identify and secure sleeping sites that provided meaningful protection against the primary predator threats. For primates that retained significant arboreal capability, tall trees with dense canopy provided one form of protection. For more terrestrial species, rocky outcroppings with ledges and crevices accessible only through narrow approaches provided another form. Caves and cave-adjacent rock faces combined elements of both approaches, the height and restricted access of rocky terrain, combined with the shelter and concealment of enclosed space. The Swartkrans cave site, one of the most important sources of Dinopithecus fossil material and also one of the richest sources of early hominin fossils, may itself provide a kind of indirect evidence of this sleeping site competition. The complex depositional history of the cave, which appears to have served as a den site for various carnivores, a trap for animals falling through a ceiling opening, and a location frequented by various primate species over a long period, tells a story of multiple species using the same physical location in different periods and for different purposes. The concentration of hominin and Dinopithecus fossils in the same site does not necessarily mean the two species were using the cave simultaneously. The deposits represent accumulations over thousands of years, but it does confirm that both species were drawn to the same general type of location, and that the cave environment was a valued resource for both. The implications of this shared preference for the same types of sleeping sites are significant. In any given area of the landscape, the number of truly good sleeping sites, sites that provided meaningful protection against the major predator threats, was limited. The distribution of caves, rocky outcroppings, and other suitable sheltering locations is determined by the underlying geology and topography, not by the number of species that want to use them. In a landscape where both large Dinopithecus troops and smaller hominin groups were competing for the same limited inventory of protected sleeping sites, the competitive dynamics around those sites would have been intense. And given the raw physical advantage held by Dinopithecus in any direct confrontation, early hominins would have been consistently losing these competitions unless they developed strategies that allowed them to access good sleeping sites without entering into direct physical confrontation with their larger competitors. What strategies might those have been? Timing was probably key. If Dinopithecus troops had predictable patterns of when they occupied particular sites, which is consistent with the home range-based territorial behavior of modern baboons, early hominins might have learned to exploit the gaps in that occupancy, using a sleeping site during periods when the local Dinopithecus troop had moved to a different part of their range. Moving into a site in the brief window between when the Dinopithecus troop left for morning foraging and when dangerous predators became active, monitoring the movements of the troop closely enough to predict these windows. This kind of behavioral flexibility, applied to the specific challenge of navigating around a powerful competitor, is exactly the type of sophisticated environmental monitoring and prediction that would have driven the evolution of improved spatial memory, social information sharing, and temporal planning, all foundational elements of the cognitive toolkit that eventually became modern human intelligence. The question of whether early hominins ever actively competed with Dinopithecus for resources, whether they ever, in any meaningful sense, went head-to-head with these giant primates rather than simply avoiding them, is one that touches on something important about what kind of creatures our earliest ancestors were. The image of early hominins as perpetually running from everything larger than themselves is probably an oversimplification. Modern studies of chimpanzees have shown that even relatively small primates will engage in surprisingly bold and aggressive competitive behavior when the stakes are high enough and when the group size provides sufficient support. And early hominins, while physically smaller and less robustly built than Dinopithecus, were social animals with their own group cohesion and their own capacity for coordinated behavior. There are plausible scenarios in which early hominin groups might have successfully challenged Dinopithecus access to resources under specific conditions. A small number of Dinopithecus individuals, a few peripheral animals separated from the main troop, or a pair of young males not yet integrated into a dominant hierarchy, might have been driven away from a food source by a coordinated group of hominins using noise, threat display, and the kind of collective confidence that comes from group membership. This kind of competitive confrontation, more about display than about actual physical fighting, is documented in modern primates and would have been a viable strategy when the odds were at least somewhat favorable. But these would have been exceptional situations, not the norm. The general pattern of hominin-Dinopithecus interaction was almost certainly one of avoidance and accommodation on the hominin side, a pragmatic recognition that direct competition with something so much more physically powerful was rarely worth the risk. The hominins that survived long enough to reproduce and pass their genes forward were in all likelihood the ones who were best at reading the situation correctly, knowing when to yield, when to move, when to wait, and when to take advantage of the brief windows of opportunity that arose when the competitive pressure from Dinopithecus was temporarily reduced. This is not weakness. This is sophisticated environmental judgment. And it is exactly the kind of judgment that, accumulated over thousands of generations, built the cognitive and behavioral foundation of the human species. As we approach the midpoint of our examination of Dinopithecus and its world, it is worth stepping back to consider the broader significance of this story, what it means, not just as a chapter in paleontological history, but as a lens through which we can better understand ourselves. We live in a world so comprehensively transformed by human activity that it is easy to forget how recent our dominance is, and how tenuous it was for most of our evolutionary history. The early hominins of the Plio-Pleistocene were not inevitable future rulers of the planet. They were small, vulnerable members of a diverse and highly competitive ecological community, living on margins that offered no guarantees and that could close off entirely with a single bad drought or a single bad night. The distance between survival and extinction was not measured in centuries or even decades. For a small group in a resource-limited landscape, it could be measured in days or weeks, a dry season that lasted just a little too long. A troop of Dinopithecus that claimed the water source your group had been depending on, a leopard that took 2 of your best adults in the same season, a disease that moved through the group and left the children without sufficient adult protection. Any of these, or any combination of them, could end a lineage, could snip a thread in the tapestry of human evolutionary history that we would never know had been there. That our lineage survived, that the thread was not snipped, that the margins held, that generation after generation of early hominins found enough food, found enough water, found enough safe sleeping sites, survived enough encounters with enough dangerous animals, and produced enough offspring who did the same is genuinely remarkable. Not because it required superhuman capacity or because our ancestors were in any way specially chosen or protected, but because the odds at any given moment in any given season were not obviously in their favor. They made it because they were smart enough and social enough and adaptable enough to squeeze through the gaps that Dinopithecus left uncovered, the gaps between carnivore territories, the gaps in the seasonal rainfall patterns, the gaps in the competitive landscape that a clever, flexible, information-sharing social primate could exploit. And Dinopithecus in its massive, intimidating, ecologically powerful presence helped make them that way. The diet of early hominins in the context of this competitive landscape is another dimension worth exploring carefully, because food, its availability, its distribution, and the competition for it was the fundamental organizing principle around which everything else in early hominin life was structured. Early hominins were, like Dinopithecus, generalist omnivores. They ate plant foods of various kinds, fruits, leaves, seeds, roots, and tubers, various types of grass seeds, and other small-scale plant products. They also consumed animal protein when they could get it, whether through active hunting of small animals, opportunistic scavenging of carcasses killed by large carnivores, or the processing of insects and other small invertebrates that might not seem like meaningful food sources by modern standards, but that could provide critical protein and fat during lean times. The overlap between this diet and the diet of Dinopithecus was substantial. Both species were competing for the same suite of plant foods across most categories. Both were opportunistic protein consumers. Both depended on the same seasonal pulses of fruit and seed availability that characterized the variable early South African landscape. This dietary overlap is part of what made the competitive relationship between the two species so structurally significant. It was not just that Dinopithecus was physically intimidating. It was that Dinopithecus wanted the same things that early hominins needed. One area where early hominins may have had a comparative advantage is in the processing of underground storage organs, the roots, tubers, and bulbs that provide an important caloric buffer during dry seasons when surface plant foods are scarce. While Dinopithecus would certainly have dug for and eaten such items using their hands and perhaps sticks or stones in an improvised fashion, the early development of stone tool use by hominins gave them increasingly effective tools for processing these items, for cutting, pounding, and breaking open tough root materials in ways that would have allowed more efficient caloric extraction than simple hand processing. This advantage was probably marginal in the early stages of stone tool development, but it was real, and it pointed toward the trajectory that would eventually give hominins a decisive competitive advantage over all their neighbors. The seasonal dimension of food availability deserves particular emphasis. In a landscape where rainfall was variable and where the fruiting and seeding of plants tracked the rainfall closely, the period between the end of one fruiting season and the beginning of the next was a period of intense resource stress. This was the lean season, the time when the easily accessible, high-calorie food sources had been consumed or had dried up and fallen, when the above-ground vegetation was at its most desiccated and least nutritious, and when every foraging animal in the landscape was competing for whatever remained. For large animals with high caloric requirements, the lean season was a genuine survival challenge. For Dinopithecus, which needed to sustain a body mass of 80 kilograms or more on a daily basis, the demands of the lean season were particularly acute. Early hominins, smaller in body size and therefore with lower absolute caloric requirements, had a structural advantage during lean seasons, not because they were better foragers in absolute terms, but because they needed less. They could survive on food patches that would not have sustained a Dinopithecus individual or troop. This size-based metabolic advantage is one of the recurring themes in the story of primate evolution, and it helps explain why smaller-bodied primates have often been more ecologically resilient in the face of habitat change than their larger relatives. The giant primates Dinopithecus, the various giant colobines that lived in parts of Asia and Africa during the same period, and ultimately even the giant apes like Gigantopithecus, were all, to some degree, vulnerable to the same logic. Large body size is advantageous in competitive interactions but costly in terms of caloric requirements, and when resources become scarce, the cost can outweigh the benefit. The acoustic landscape of early South Africa is something that rarely features in discussions of hominin evolution, but it is worth pausing to consider, because sound was one of the primary channels through which early hominins gathered information about their environment, including information about the location and behavior of Dinopithecus troops. The African bush is a soundscape of extraordinary richness and complexity, and for any primate living within it, the ability to interpret that soundscape accurately was a survival skill of the first order. A large Dinopithecus troop on the move through woodland would have been audible from a considerable distance, the calling and barking of adult males, the chatter of social interactions within the group, the noise of a large number of bodies moving through vegetation. These sounds would have been immediately interpretable to any early hominin within range, providing real-time information about the troop's location, direction of movement, and general state, whether it was moving calmly, whether it had been alarmed by something, whether it was engaged in a dispute at a resource site. This acoustic information would have been invaluable for planning the hominin group's own movements, whether to approach a resource site currently occupied by the troop, whether to hold position and wait for the troop to move on, whether to alter the planned route for the day to avoid an area where the Dinopithecus sounds suggested active presence. The Dinopithecus troop's alarm calls would have been particularly valuable. Modern baboon alarm calls are sufficiently diverse and specific in their acoustic structure that experienced observers can often determine from the call alone what type of predator is present, whether it is a ground-level predator or an aerial predator, whether it is close or distant, whether the baboons are in flight or in a mobbing posture. This information is useful not just to other baboons, but to any animal in the vicinity capable of interpreting the signal. Early hominins, with their strong selective pressure towards social information processing and their close evolutionary relationship with the broader primate lineage, would very likely have been capable of extracting meaningful threat information from Dinopithecus alarm vocalizations. This cross-species acoustic communication, this eavesdropping on a competitor's communication system, represents a fascinating dimension of the interspecies relationship that is entirely consistent with what we know about modern primate communities. It suggests that the relationship between early hominins and Dinopithecus was not simply one of competition and avoidance, but also of complex informational interdependence. Each species, in monitoring the behavior and vocalizations of the other, was gaining valuable ecological information. And for early hominins, with their relatively smaller physical power and their greater dependence on cognitive strategy for survival, this informational dimension of the relationship may have been particularly important. Let us close the first part of our exploration of Dinopithecus with a reflection on time, specifically, on the extraordinary length of the period during which these interactions between giant baboons and early hominins were playing out. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of years. We are talking about timescales so vast that the entire recorded history of human civilization, every empire, every dynasty, every major technological revolution from the first cities to the present, fits into a tiny fraction of the period we are discussing. The interactions between early hominins and Dinopithecus were not a single event or a brief episode. They were a sustained, multi-generational, evolutionary scale encounter that shaped both lineages over timescales that dwarf anything in the historical record. Generation after generation of early hominins lived in landscapes where Dinopithecus was a constant presence. Children grew up learning to read the signs of Dinopithecus' presence, the sounds, the smells, the patterns of movement, the types of terrain the troops preferred, the seasonal variations in their ranging behavior. Adults passed this knowledge to younger members of their groups through the proto-linguistic communication systems that were the ancestors of human language. The most successful groups, the ones that survived, that had enough offspring who also survived, that maintained cohesion across the lean seasons and the dangerous nights, were the groups that had the best accumulated knowledge of Dinopithecus behavior and the best strategies for navigating the competitive landscape that Dinopithecus represented. This is evolution in action, not as a dramatic moment of transformation, but as the slow, patient, grinding work of selection across thousands of generations. Each generation slightly better at the relevant cognitive tasks than the last, not because any individual woke up one day transformed, but because the individuals with the slightly better spatial memory, the slightly better social coordination, the slightly better capacity for predicting competitor behavior, were the ones who left slightly more surviving offspring, who inherited those traits and expressed them in slightly more refined forms. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these slight advantages compound into transformative change. Dinopithecus was part of that compounding, not the whole story, not the only selective force, not the only challenge, not the only teacher, but a real and significant part of the pressure that shaped the creatures that would eventually become us. The giant baboon that haunted our ancestors was also, in a very real sense, one of the architects of what we are. And that story, that uncomfortable, unsentimental, genuinely fascinating story, deserves to be told in full. Which is exactly what we will continue to do in the second part of this documentary, where we will go deeper into the fossil evidence, the ecological dynamics of the late Plio-Pleistocene, the eventual decline of Dinopithecus, and the final chapter of this remarkable story of competition, survival, and evolutionary transformation. Stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we encourage you to go back and watch part 1 of this documentary first, because what we are about to explore builds directly on the foundation we have already laid. And if you have been with us from the beginning, then you already understand the scale of what we are dealing with, the vast stretches of time, the extraordinary complexity of the early South African ecosystem, and the remarkable story of how two very different kinds of primate navigated the same dangerous, beautiful, unforgiving landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. In part 1, we established the basic ecological and evolutionary context. We introduced Dinopithecus in terms of its size, its social structure, its dietary habits, and its physical capabilities. we explored what it meant on a daily and seasonal basis for early hominins to share territory with a creature of this power and sophistication, and we began to trace the ways in which that competitive pressure may have shaped the evolution of early human cognition and behavior. Now, in part 2, we are going to go deeper. We are going to examine the fossil record with greater precision, looking carefully at what the physical evidence actually tells us, and just as importantly, what it does not and cannot tell us. We are going to trace the environmental changes that define the later period of Dinopithecus's existence and examine what those changes meant for both the giant baboon and its hominin neighbors. We are going to explore the question of Dinopithecus's extinction in detail, who and what was responsible, and what that extinction meant for the ecological landscape that early Homo was inheriting. And we are going to end where this story ultimately lies, with a reflection on what the life and death of Dinopithecus tells us about the nature of human survival, the contingency of evolutionary success, and the sobering reality that we exist today not because our ancestors were destined to triumph, but because generation after generation they managed, just barely sometimes, to survive. This is a story about deep time and real stakes. Let us continue. We left part 1 with a reflection on time, on the extraordinary length of the period during which early hominins and Dinopithecus shared the South African landscape. Let us now use that temporal framework as a structural guide for the second part of our exploration, moving through time more deliberately and examining how the relationship between these two lineages evolved as the world around them changed, because the world did change, dramatically, repeatedly. And those changes were not background noise. They were the fundamental driver of nearly everything that happened in the evolutionary story we are tracing. The early Plio-Pleistocene, when Dinopithecus was at or near its ecological peak, was already a period of significant environmental variability. But as we move through the period from roughly 2.5 million years ago toward 2 million years ago, and then into the period approaching 1.5 million years ago, the pace and the amplitude of environmental change accelerated. This is a well-documented feature of global climate history during this period: the intensification of glacial cycles in the northern hemisphere, the expansion and contraction of polar ice sheets, and the cascading effects of those changes on the climate systems of the tropics and subtropics. Africa, while far from the polar ice sheets themselves, was not insulated from these changes. The continent's rainfall patterns, its vegetation communities, and the distribution of habitats across its landscapes were all profoundly affected by the same global climate dynamics that were building glaciers in the far north. For the ecosystems of South Africa specifically, the trend over this period was broadly toward drier and more open conditions. The mosaic of forest, woodland, and grassland that had characterized the early Plio-Pleistocene was gradually shifting toward a landscape with less forest, less dense woodland, and more open grassland. This shift was not smooth or linear. It proceeded in pulses, with periods of relative forest expansion followed by periods of rapid contraction, tracking the rhythm of global climate cycles. But the overall trajectory, viewed across the full sweep of the period we are examining, was clearly toward more open, drier conditions. And that trajectory had profound implications for every species living in the affected ecosystems. For Dinopithecus, the implications were particularly significant. Large primates like Dinopithecus are, ecologically speaking, creatures of woodland and forest edge environments. They need trees for sleeping sites, for certain categories of food, for the kind of structural complexity that a large, socially complex primate depends on for its daily activities. As woodland contracted and grassland expanded, the habitat that Dinopithecus depended on became less extensive, more fragmented, and more variable in its productivity. Patches of suitable, smaller, and more widely separated. The seasonal pulses of fruit and other high-quality food became shorter and less reliable. And the populations of Dinopithecus that depended on those habitat patches became smaller, more isolated, and more vulnerable to the kind of random fluctuations in survival and reproduction that can push a small population toward extinction even without any specific catastrophic event. This process, the gradual fragmentation and degradation of habitat leading to increasingly isolated and vulnerable populations, is one of the most common pathways to extinction in the fossil record. It does not require a dramatic event. It does not require a sudden crisis. It operates slowly over many generations, often invisibly to the organisms experiencing it. A troop of Dinopithecus living in a shrinking woodland patch in an increasingly arid landscape did not know that their habitat was degrading. They simply experienced, season after season, the increasing difficulty of finding enough food, the increasing distance to water, the increasing exposure to predators as the cover that had protected them thinned. And generation after generation, the reproductive success of the troop declined slightly, the group grew slightly smaller, the buffer against catastrophe shrank slightly, until eventually there was not enough buffer left. The story of habitat change in this period is not solely a story of loss, however. The same climatic changes that were reducing the woodland habitat that Dinopithecus depended on were simultaneously creating new opportunities in the expanding grasslands, opportunities that different species were positioned to exploit in different ways. The expansion of African grasslands during this period drove the diversification and proliferation of grazing animals, the great herds of wildebeest and zebra and antelope ancestors, whose modern descendants still dominate the east and southern African savannas. This proliferation of large herbivores in turn supported the expansion and diversification of the large carnivore guild, the lions, the hunting dogs, the hyenas that fed on these abundant prey populations. For early Homo, the expanding grasslands presented both challenges and opportunities. The challenge was the reduced cover and increased exposure that open grassland environments brought more visibility for predators, fewer trees for emergency escape, greater distances between water and between food patches. The opportunity was access to the extraordinary protein resource represented by the large herds of grazing animals, a resource that, properly exploited through a combination of scavenging and increasingly effective hunting, could sustain hominin populations at a level that the more patchy woodland resources could not. The transition from a primarily plant food-based diet toward a greater reliance on animal protein, a transition that is documented in the archaeological and fossil record through a combination of isotopic analysis of early hominin bones, the distribution of stone tool scatters in association with butchered animal bones, and evidence of increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies, was not a simple dietary shift. It was a fundamental reorganization of the ecological role of early Homo in the African ecosystem. It moved hominins up the food chain, into direct competition with herbivores for access to the large herbivore prey base, and it required a suite of adaptations, physical, cognitive, and social, that collectively drove some of the most significant changes in the hominin body and brain during this period. The increase in brain size that characterizes the transition from early Australopithecus to early Homo, and then the further increases within the Homo lineage, are among the most dramatic changes in the entire human fossil record. A larger brain is metabolically expensive. The human brain consumes a disproportionate fraction of the body's total energy budget, far more than the brains of our primate relatives relative to body size. For this kind of energetically costly tissue to be maintained and expanded by natural selection, the benefits it provides must be substantial. And the benefits that a larger, more capable brain provided in the complex, competitive, predator-rich, and resource-variable environment of early South Africa were indeed substantial: better social coordination, better planning, better communication, better ability to track the behavior of competitors like Dinopithecus and adjust strategies accordingly. From animal sources was part of what paid the metabolic bill for this expanding brain. High-quality animal sources provided the caloric foundation that allowed the growth and maintenance of more energetically expensive. This is a feedback loop of considerable elegance. More brain tissue allowed better strategies for accessing animal protein, and more animal protein allowed the growth and maintenance of more brain tissue. The two processes reinforced each other, driving a trajectory of brain expansion and behavioral sophistication that, over hundreds of thousands of years, produced something qualitatively different from anything that had existed before. In this context of expanding cognitive capability and dietary flexibility, the relationship between early Homo and Dinopithecus was shifting subtly but meaningfully from the earlier period we examined in Part 1. Early hominins of the Australopithecus period had been, relative to Dinopithecus, at a significant disadvantage in nearly every dimension of direct competition. They were smaller, physically weaker, socially less coordinated in terms of collective defense, and cognitively less equipped for the kind of sophisticated environmental monitoring and strategic planning that might have allowed them to consistently outmaneuver a competitor. Their primary strategy with respect to Dinopithecus was almost certainly avoidance. Give the troop wide berth, monitor its movements carefully, and exploit resources in areas and at times when the troop was elsewhere. But as early Homo developed more sophisticated stone tools, more coordination, and possibly the earliest uses of fire, and to shift. Quickly or suddenly, evolution way, and the selective behavioral change operate over many rather than within individual life. But gradually, over the course of hundreds, the gap between hominin capability was narrowed. Not because Dinopithecus was declining, in fact, as a Dinopithecus remained as physically throughout its existence, but because early new cavity that Dinopithecus and that increased for the physics that hominins competition tools are these new capabilities which appeared a million years ago by the Acheulean immersive tool technology, characterized by large, carefully shaped bifacial tools that required substantially more planning, more skill, and more investment in the knapping process than Alduin tools had demanded. The appearance of Acheulean tools around 1.5 to 1.7 million years ago correlates closely with the emergence of Homo erectus, the first member of our lineage to have a brain size and body proportions close to the modern human range, and the first to spread out of Africa into other continents. The Acheulean toolkit was not just more sophisticated in technique, it was more versatile in application, capable of being used for a wider range of tasks including the butchery of large animals, the processing of plant materials, and possibly the working of wood and other organic materials that do not preserve in the fossil record. The relationship between this increasing technological capability and the competitive dynamics with Dinopithecus is indirect but real. Better tools meant better access to high-quality food resources. Better access to food meant better nutritional status for hominin groups. Better nutritional status meant better survival, better reproduction, and larger or more stable group sizes. Larger, more stable hominin groups were more capable of collective action, including the collective defense behavior and collective resource competition that would have allowed them to engage with Dinopithecus on somewhat less unequal terms than their smaller, less capable ancestors had been able to manage. Fire is the other great technological transition of this period, and it deserves careful attention, both for what it actually did for early hominins and for what it did not do, at least not immediately. The earliest convincing evidence of controlled fire use by hominins comes from sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where evidence of burning dating to around 1 million years ago has been identified, and from various East African sites with somewhat older but more debated evidence of fire use. The timeline of fire's adoption into the hominin behavioral repertoire is still a matter of active scientific debate, with some researchers arguing for much earlier use and others maintaining that regular, controlled fire use was a relatively late development in hominin evolution. What is not debated is the transformative nature of fire as a technology once it was adopted. Fire provided warmth in cold conditions. It provided light in darkness. It provided protection from predators. The large carnivores of early Africa, including leopards, lions, and hyenas, have a well-documented avoidance response to fire that would have made a hominin camp with an active fire substantially safer than one without. Fire allowed the cooking of food, which has significant nutritional implications. Cooking breaks down plant cell walls, making the caloric content of plant foods more accessible, and it denatures proteins and kills pathogens in meat, making animal protein safer and more nutritionally available. And fire transformed the social dynamics of hominin groups by creating a focal point for evening social activity, a gathering place where individuals could interact, communicate, and build social bonds after the foraging day was over, extending the period of active social life beyond the hours of daylight and potentially driving the development of more sophisticated communication systems. For the competitive relationship with Dinopithecus specifically, fire's significance was multifaceted. As a predator deterrent, fire dramatically changed the calculation of nighttime safety for hominin groups. Groups that could maintain a fire at their sleeping site were protected from the leopard threat in a way that no purely behavioral strategy had previously allowed. This freed early Homo from some of the constraints that had previously governed sleeping site selection, the absolute dependence on elevated, structurally protected sites was somewhat reduced when the group could generate its own protective zone through fire. This did not eliminate the value of good sleeping sites, but it did expand the range of locations that could function as acceptable sleeping sites, giving hominin groups more flexibility in their movement patterns. For Dinopithecus, this growing hominin capability with fire would have been directly observable, not in the sense that Dinopithecus understood the technology or its implications in any abstract sense, but in the sense that troops would have encountered the signs of hominin fire use, the smell of smoke, the light visible at a distance, the burned areas around former sleeping sites, and would have incorporated this information into their own behavioral responses. Whether Dinopithecus actively avoided areas associated with hominin fire use, as many large carnivores do, is an intriguing question that we cannot answer from the fossil record. But it is at least plausible that the growing hominin association with fire added an additional layer of deterrence to what had previously been a purely behavioral and cognitive competitive repertoire. The sites of early South Africa tell us a great deal about this period of transition, and they do so not just through the bones and tools they contain, but through the spatial relationships between those items. The way the evidence is arranged, layered, and associated across the cave and open-air sites that preserve the record of early hominin and Dinopithecus activity. Taphonomy, the study of how organisms and their remains enter and are modified by the fossil record, is an essential tool here, because sites were not created by tidy natural archivists. They were created by a messy combination of carnivore activity, water transport, roof collapse, decomposition, and occasional direct hominin deposition, all operating simultaneously in sequential time periods. At Swartkrans, extensively studied of the crater sites, the taphonomic analysis has revealed a fascinating and somewhat grim story. The cave deposits contain the remains of multiple hominin individuals, both Australopithecus robustus and early Homo, along with the remains of Dinopithecus carnivores and ungulates. The arrangement and modification of the hominin bones suggests that many of the individuals ended up in the cave not by their own choice, but as the result of predator activity, most likely leopard predation. The same patterns of bone damage and skeletal element representation that are associated with leopard kills in modern studies are present on some of the hominin material at Swartkrans, suggesting that at least some of the early humans whose bones ended up in the cave were brought there by leopards who used the cave or its environs as a feeding or denning site. This is a sobering reminder of the reality of early hominin life. These were not creatures living in security, visiting the cave occasionally to drop off their dead. These were, at least in some cases, prey animals, hunted, killed, and consumed by the leopards that also inhabited the same landscape. And this leopard predation did not discriminate between hominin species. Both Australopithecus robustus and early Homo are represented in the site's predation-associated deposits, suggesting that the leopards of this period were flexible enough to take whatever primate presented itself as an accessible target. The Dinopithecus remains at Swartkrans likely ended up in the deposit through a similar combination of mechanisms: direct predation, natural death and subsequent scavenging, and the various other pathways by which large animal remains enter cave systems. The presence of Dinopithecus material in the same deposits as hominin material does not tell us directly about the interaction between the two species during their lives, but it does confirm that both species were regular presences in the same landscape at the same time, drawn to the same geological features, and exposed to the same predator pressures. What the Swartkrans deposits do tell us, when read carefully against the full taphonomic context, is something important about the ecological community of the time, about the density of competing and interacting species, about the intensity of predator pressure on all primate species including both hominins and Dinopithecus, and about the fundamental character of this landscape as one in which survival was genuinely hard-won and in which no species was operating with significant margins of safety. Everyone was at risk, everyone was competing, everyone was, to some degree, both predator and prey in a system of extraordinary ecological complexity. The relationship between predator pressure and interspecies competition, the way that shared predator threats can paradoxically shape the competitive interactions between prey species, is one of the more subtle and interesting dimensions of the Dinopithecus story. In modern ecological theory, shared predation is recognized as a significant force that can create unexpected patterns of attraction or avoidance between species that compete with each other for other resources. The principle is relatively simple. If two species share a common predator, and if the presence of the other species in the same area changes the predator's hunting efficiency, either increasing it or decreasing it, then there are circumstances under which one species might actually benefit from the proximity of its competitor. Applied to the Dinopithecus hominin interaction, this principle suggests some intriguing possibilities. A large Dinopithecus troop, with its formidable collective defense capability and its loud, constant alarm calling, was in many ways a very effective early warning system for the leopards and other predators that operated in the same landscape. Any predator attempting to approach a Dinopithecus troop would face immediate detection, loud alarm calling that alerted every other animal in the vicinity, and potentially aggressive collective mobbing from the troop itself. For a hominin group within earshot of a Dinopithecus troop, the troop's alarm calls provided early warning of predator presence that could be literally life-saving. At the same time, the presence of a large Dinopithecus troop in an area might have drawn predator attention toward the troop and away from smaller, less collectively defended hominin groups in the same general area. A leopard deciding which target to pursue would, all else being equal, prefer the easier target, and a small, physically unimpressive group of hominins might have been easier targets than the massive, collectively aggressive Dinopithecus troop. This is not to suggest that Dinopithecus served as a deliberate shield for hominins. It was not, and any hominin group that got too close to a Dinopithecus troop for protection from predators would have been trading one threat for another. But the incidental protection offered by being in the general vicinity of a large, alarming capable primate troop, while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct competitive confrontation, may have been one of the subtle ecological benefits that early hominins extracted from the complex relationship with their giant baboon neighbors. This kind of nuanced, multidimensional interspecies relationship, simultaneously competitive and incidentally beneficial, simultaneously threatening and inadvertently protective, is characteristic of the kind of ecological complexity that prevails in high-diversity primate communities. Modern studies of mixed-species primate groups in various parts of Africa and Asia have documented the extraordinary subtlety of these relationships, in which species that compete directly for food resources may nonetheless associate with each other because the collective predator detection capability of the mixed group outweighs the costs of the competitive interactions. Whether early hominins and Dinopithecus ever formed anything like a loose mixed-species association, maintaining proximity while managing competition through behavioral mechanisms, is something we cannot determine from the available evidence. But the ecological logic that would have made such an arrangement beneficial for both parties, at least under some conditions, is clearly present. The question of what Dinopithecus looked like in motion, how it carried its massive body across the landscape, how it navigated between the various habitat types that composed its world, and how its locomotor style influenced its ecological interactions with early hominins, is one that the fossil record frustratingly cannot answer directly, but that has significant implications for how we think about the competitive relationship. As we noted in Part 1, the postcranial skeleton of Dinopithecus is essentially unknown. We have the skull and the teeth. We do not have the limb bones, the shoulder girdle, the pelvic structure, or the vertebral column that would allow a direct reconstruction of the animal's locomotor anatomy and capability. What we can do is reason carefully from the comparative anatomy of modern baboons and other large cercopithecid primates. Modern baboons are primarily terrestrial animals. They spend most of their time on the ground, moving quadrupedally across the landscape, but they retain the arboreal capability that all cercopithecids possess and use trees and rocky surfaces for sleeping and for escape from predators. Their quadrupedal terrestrial locomotion is efficient and capable, allowing them to cover substantial distances across their home ranges on a daily basis. Their climbing ability, while not as specialized as that of arboreal primates, is sufficient for accessing sleeping trees and rocky ledges. For Dinopithecus, with a body mass potentially twice or more that of the largest modern baboons, the biomechanical demands of locomotion would have been substantially different. Larger body size generally shifts the balance of locomotor strategy. Very large primates tend to be more terrestrial and less arboreal than their smaller relatives, simply because the structural demands of supporting and moving great mass make arboreal locomotion increasingly costly and risky. Gorillas, the largest living primates, are essentially terrestrial despite their primate heritage and retain only limited arboreal capability. If Dinopithecus was as large as the largest estimates suggest, it may have been correspondingly more committed to terrestrial modern baboons, using rocky terrain and large trees for sleeping, but spending most of its active time on the ground. This would have significant implications for its ecological footprint. A highly terrestrial large primate covering its home range quadrupedally would have been a powerful presence in the ground-level ecological matrix, moving efficiently across open and semi-open terrain, capable of accessing food patches across a wide area, and presenting a formidable physical presence at ground level that would have been immediately apparent to any other ground-level animal in the vicinity. Early hominins, who were themselves committed to terrestrial bipedal locomotion, would have encountered Dinopithecus primarily at ground level, not in the trees, not at the water's edge where various species might have congregated, but in the open and semi-open terrain that both species traversed in their daily foraging activities. The encounter between a small group of bipedal hominins and a Dinopithecus troop moving across the same terrain would have been, from the hominin perspective, an encounter requiring immediate situational assessment. How large is the troop? Which direction is it moving? How close is it? Are the males alert and oriented toward the hominin group, or are they focused on something else? Is there room to move away without approaching closer to the troop, or is the terrain constraining options? All of these questions would have required rapid processing of visual and auditory information, rapid social communication within the hominin group about the appropriate response, and coordinated movement, all skills that were under strong selection pressure in this environment, and all skills that contributed to the expanding cognitive toolkit of early Homo. Among the most significant but least discussed aspects of the Dinopithecus story is what it reveals about the cognitive demands of living in a landscape populated by multiple large, socially complex species. Modern cognitive science has identified a strong relationship between social complexity and cognitive capability across primates, the so-called social brain hypothesis, which proposes that the driving force behind the expansion of primate brain size is not the complexity of the physical environment, but the complexity of the social environment, specifically the demands of tracking and managing relationships within large social groups. The individuals who are best at social cognition, best at remembering who is allied with whom, best at predicting the behavior of other individuals based on past experience, best at navigating the politics of a complex social hierarchy, are the individuals that do best in terms of reproductive success within primate societies. But the social environment that early hominins were navigating was not limited to the social complexity of their own groups. It extended to the interspecies social landscape, the complex web of relationships between their own group and the groups of other species with which they regularly interacted. Dinopithecus troops had their own internal social structures, their own dominance hierarchies, their own intergroup dynamics. A Dinopithecus troop encountered at a water source might behave very differently depending on whether it was a large, high-ranking troop in its core territory or a smaller peripheral troop in an area it used only seasonally. The same location, the same time of year, could present very different risk profiles depending on which specific Dinopithecus group happened to be present and what its internal social dynamics were at that particular moment. Early hominins that could track this intergroup variation, that had sufficient memory and attentional resources to maintain differentiated representations of multiple distinct Dinopithecus troops as separate social entities with their own behavioral profiles, were substantially better positioned to make good decisions in their encounters with those troops than hominins that could not make these fine distinctions. This is an extremely demanding cognitive task. It requires maintaining separate mental representations of multiple social groups, updating those representations based on new observations, and retrieving the appropriate representation rapidly in the context of an encounter that might develop quickly and require immediate decision-making. It is, in essence, an extended theory of mind applied not just to other members of one's own species, but to the social structure of a competing species. The cognitive demands of this kind of extended social intelligence, tracking the identities, relationships, territories, and behavioral tendencies of multiple social groups of multiple species simultaneously, are substantial. They require exactly the kind of neural machinery that the archaeological and fossil record suggests was expanding and becoming more sophisticated during precisely this period of hominin evolution. The expanding prefrontal cortex, the growing temporal lobe regions associated with social memory and face recognition, the developing connectivity between brain regions that allows rapid integration of multiple information streams. All of these developments, traceable in the hominin fossil record through the changing shape and size of the brain case, are consistent with the demands of exactly this kind of complex interspecies social environment. Let us turn now to a more detailed examination of the specific sites that have yielded the fossil evidence for Dinopithecus, because understanding where the evidence comes from helps us understand both what it tells us and where its limits lie. The Cradle of Humankind, the UNESCO World Heritage Site that encompasses many of the most important paleoanthropological sites in South Africa, is a landscape defined by the geology of the Malmani Dolomites, ancient carbonate rocks that have been dissolved and reshaped by groundwater over millions of years to create an extraordinary network of caves, sinkholes, underground chambers, and rocky outcroppings. It is this geology that is responsible for both the richness of the fossil record in the region and some of its most significant limitations. The cave sites Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, Kromdraai, Drimmelen, and others are the primary sources of hominin and Dinopithecus fossils from this region. Each cave has its own depositional history, its own unique combination of taphonomic pathways that determined how animal remains ended up in the deposit, and its own chronological framework established through a combination of biostratigraphy, paleomagnetism, and radiometric dating methods. Understanding the depositional history of each site is essential for interpreting the fossil material correctly, for understanding which species were contemporaneous with which others, which deposits represent different time periods rather than the same moment in time, and which associations between species in the same deposit reflect actual ecological associations during life versus the coincidental mixing of material from different time periods. At Swartkrans, where some of the most important Dinopithecus material has been found, the deposit is divided into multiple members representing different time periods, each with its own distinctive faunal assemblage. The presence of Dinopithecus material in specific members of the deposit allows us to assign it to particular time periods with reasonable confidence, and the co-occurrence of Dinopithecus with specific hominin species in the same members gives us our clearest evidence for the temporal overlap between the two lineages. This evidence confirms that Dinopithecus and early Homo were present in the same general area at the same general time, probably within the same landscape community, during the period of roughly 1.8 to 1.5 million years ago. The limitations of the cave site evidence are equally important to understand. The caves are not random sample points of the landscape around them. They are specific geological features with specific catchment properties. They tend to capture the remains of animals that spent time near the cave entrance, that fell into sinkholes, or that were brought there by carnivores using the cave as a den. They do not give us a representative sample of all the animals living in the broader landscape. Species that avoided the specific microenvironments near the cave entrances would be underrepresented or absent from the deposit, regardless of how common they were in the broader landscape. Species that were frequently preyed upon by carnivores using the cave as a den would be overrepresented. These biases must be carefully accounted for when interpreting the faunal evidence from cave sites. For Dinopithecus specifically, these biases mean that the cave sites may not give us an accurate picture of how common or how widespread the species was in the broader South African landscape. The fact that Dinopithecus material is found in the cave deposits tells us that the species was present in the landscape near those caves, which is important and informative. But it does not tell us how dense the Dinopithecus population was, how extensive its range was across the broader region, or whether the individuals whose remains ended up in the cave were representative of the typical Dinopithecus individual in terms of size, age, or sex. The study of stable isotopes from fossil teeth has become one of the most powerful tools available to paleontologists for reconstructing the diets and habitat use of extinct animals, and it has been applied to the Dinopithecus material from South African cave sites with illuminating results. Carbon isotopes preserved in the enamel of fossil teeth record the types of plants that an animal consumed during the period of tooth formation. Specifically, they distinguish between plants that use the C3 photosynthetic pathway, which includes most trees, shrubs, and herbs in woodland and forest environments, and plants that use the C4 photosynthetic pathway, which includes most tropical grasses. An animal that fed primarily in woodland and forest environments would have a carbon isotope signature reflecting predominantly C3 plant consumption, while an animal that fed in open grassland environments or that consumed significant amounts of grass would show a more C4-influenced signature. The isotopic data from Dinopithecus teeth, where it has been obtained and analyzed, generally suggests a diet dominated by C3 resources, consistent with the expected dietary habits of a woodland-associated primate that consumed primarily woodland fruits, seeds, leaves, and other plant materials along with animal protein from various sources. This is consistent with the ecological inference that Dinopithecus was primarily a woodland species that would have been negatively affected by the expansion of C4 grasslands during the later part of the Plio-Pleistocene. As woodland contracted and grassland expanded, the dietary resource base that Dinopithecus's isotopic signature indicates it depended on would have become less extensive and more patchily distributed. The contrast with some early hominin isotopic signatures is instructive. Some early Homo and Paranthropus individuals show isotopic signatures suggesting a somewhat more mixed C3-C4 diet, consistent with greater dietary flexibility that included exploitation of grassland resources, whether through the consumption of C4 grass seeds, the consumption of animals that had themselves fed on C4 plants, or greater use of open grassland environments than the woodland-dependent Dinopithecus. This dietary flexibility, documented in the isotopic record, is one of the factors that would have given early Homo an advantage in adapting to the changing habitat conditions of the late Plio-Pleistocene. The ability to exploit both woodland and grassland resources gave early Homo access to a broader dietary base than a species committed primarily to woodland resources. The isotopic evidence, in other words, supports the broad ecological narrative we have been developing throughout this documentary. Dinopithecus was a specialist, highly capable within its preferred woodland habitat, but increasingly challenged as that habitat contracted. Early Homo was a generalist, capable of exploiting a wider range of resources across a wider range of habitat types, and therefore better positioned to maintain stable populations even as the landscape changed around them. The behavioral ecology of large baboon troops in modern Africa provides important clues for understanding how Dinopithecus might have responded to the dual pressures of habitat contraction and hominin competition. Modern baboon populations living at the interface between woodland and grassland habitats, which is, in many ways, a reasonable analog for the transitional habitats that characterized much of early South Africa during the later Plio-Pleistocene, show interesting patterns of behavioral flexibility that allow them to exploit both habitat types while managing the risks associated with each. Troops operating in these transitional habitats tend to have larger home ranges than troops in more productive woodland habitats, because they need to cover more ground to find the same quantity of food in a more dispersed landscape. They also tend to spend more time in open ground during the day, taking advantage of the grassland food resources that are accessible there, while retreating to woodland or rocky features at night for the predator protection those environments provide. This behavioral pattern, more extensive daytime ranging across open ground, concentrated nighttime use of protective structural features, would have characterized Dinopithecus populations in the increasingly open and transitional landscapes of the later Plio-Pleistocene. The implications for hominin-Dinopithecus interaction of this kind of extended ranging behavior are significant. Troops that cover more ground each day are more likely to encounter other species across a wider area of the landscape. Troops that spend more time in open ground are more visible and more audible over greater distances. And troops that are under nutritional stress from a contracting food resource base may be more aggressive in defending access to high-quality food patches, since each individual patch represents a larger fraction of the troop's total food budget. All of these factors would have made the interactions between Dinopithecus and early Homo more frequent, more spatially extensive, and potentially more intense during the later period of Dinopithecus's existence than they had been in the earlier period when woodland was more extensive and food resources more plentiful. This intensification of competitive interactions at the same time that early Homo was becoming more cognitively sophisticated and technologically capable creates a fascinating dynamic in which the pressures on both species were changing rapidly and simultaneously. Dinopithecus, under increasing nutritional and habitat stress, may have been more behaviorally aggressive and more territorially intense, defending food patches more vigorously, ranging more widely and thus encountering hominins more frequently, and potentially exhibiting the kinds of behavioral changes under resource stress that modern primatologists observe in baboon populations experiencing habitat degradation. Early Homo, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly capable of strategic response to exactly these kinds of competitive encounters, better at coordinating group behavior, better at using landscape features strategically, better at planning movements to avoid or circumvent Dinopithecus presence. The late phase of the Dinopithecus-Homo interaction may therefore have been, paradoxically, more intense and more cognitively demanding than the earlier phases, not because Dinopithecus was more powerful, but because both species were operating under greater stress and were interacting more frequently across a more constrained and contested landscape. Group size is one of the most important variables in the ecology of social primates, and it is worth examining in detail how group size dynamics would have played out in the competitive relationship between Dinopithecus and early Homo as conditions changed. Modern primatological research has established that baboon troop sizes are strongly influenced by the productivity of the habitat. Troops in richer habitats tend to be larger, while troops in poorer or more variable habitats tend to be smaller, partly because larger groups are harder to sustain in low-productivity environments, and partly because inter-troop competition becomes more intense in resource-limited landscapes, driving some troops to fission into smaller units. For Dinopithecus populations in increasingly degraded and fragmented woodland habitats, the ecological prediction would be a gradual reduction in typical troop sizes as the habitat's carrying capacity declined. Smaller troops are less collectively powerful, fewer adult males, less collective alarm and defense capability, less ability to dominate access to key resources through sheer weight of numbers. As Dinopithecus troops became smaller in response to habitat degradation, the competitive advantage they held over early Homo groups at resource sites would have declined. A troop of 15 or 20 Dinopithecus individuals is still formidable relative to a hominin band of similar size, but it is considerably less overwhelming than a troop of 40 or 50, and the behavioral dynamic of an encounter at a contested resource site would have been correspondingly different. For early Homo, meanwhile, the trajectory of group size was probably moving in the opposite direction, toward larger and more stable social groups supported by more effective foraging strategies, better food storage or food transport capability enabled by stone tools, and the growing social infrastructure provided by more sophisticated communication and coordination. Larger, more effectively organized hominin groups would have been increasingly capable of collective competitive behavior, of coordinating responses to Dinopithecus encounters, of dividing labor in ways that allowed simultaneous management of multiple competitive and predator threats, of accumulating and sharing the accumulated ecological knowledge of multiple individuals within a group memory system. The intersection of these two trajectories, Dinopithecus troops declining in size while Homo groups grew more capable, represents one of the key dynamics driving the eventual ecological marginalization of Dinopithecus. This was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no pivotal battle, no final stand, no decisive moment in which Homo defeated Dinopithecus in some recognizable sense. It was instead a slow shifting of competitive advantage at the margins, slight changes in who got access to which resources in which situations, slight changes in the frequency and outcome of competitive encounters at contested sites, slight changes in reproductive success and survival rates that, accumulated over hundreds of generations, added up to a fundamental restructuring of the ecological community. The extinction of Dinopithecus is, from a certain perspective, one of the most important events in human evolutionary history, not because it was dramatic or sudden, but because of what it signifies about the trajectory of human ecological dominance. The disappearance of Dinopithecus from the fossil record represents the removal of one of the most significant non-carnivore competitive pressures that early hominins faced. When Dinopithecus was gone, when the giant baboons that had forced early humans to be cautious, strategic, socially coordinated, and cognitively flexible were no longer present in the landscape, the ecological pressure that had helped drive the evolution of those very qualities was removed. And what remained in the landscape they now shared primarily with carnivores and ungulates were the hominins who had been shaped by that pressure, the creatures with the spatial memory, the social coordination, the communicative sophistication, and the technological capability that centuries of competition with Dinopithecus had helped select for. The timing of Dinopithecus's extinction, around 1.5 million years ago, corresponds roughly with the emergence and spread of Homo erectus, the most capable and behaviorally sophisticated hominin that had existed to that point in evolutionary history. Homo erectus had a brain significantly larger than earlier hominins, a body plan very close to the modern human range, and a Acheulean stone tool technology far more sophisticated than anything that had preceded it, and what appears to have been a much more extensive ecological range than earlier Homo species. Homo erectus spread out of Africa, the first hominin to do so reaching parts of Asia by approximately 1.8 million years ago and eventually dispersing across a remarkable geographic range. Whether Homo erectus actively contributed to the extinction of Dinopithecus through competitive displacement is a question we cannot answer definitively. The temporal correlation is suggestive but not conclusive. What we can say is that Homo erectus was, by any reasonable ecological assessment, a significantly more capable competitor than earlier hominins, better at acquiring food from a wider range of sources, better at defending against predators, better at exploiting novel environments, and better at coordinating collective behavior within social groups. In a landscape where habitat was already declining and where Dinopithecus populations were already under stress, the addition of a more capable competitor species would have tipped the balance further against Dinopithecus survival. This scenario, a combination of habitat loss and increasing competitive pressure from an increasingly capable Homo, represents the most ecologically plausible account of Dinopithecus's extinction currently available. It does not require dramatic events or special circumstances. It requires only the continuation of the trends that were already underway, the gradual degradation of woodland habitat, the gradual improvement of hominin competitive capability, extended to their logical conclusion across the timescales that evolution operates on. There is a philosophical dimension to the Dinopithecus extinction story that deserves explicit recognition because it touches on something fundamental about the nature of evolutionary history and about the kind of story we should be telling when we discuss our own origins. The extinction of Dinopithecus was not, from a neutral ecological perspective, a good thing or a bad thing. It was simply what happened. A species that had existed successfully for over 1 million years, that had occupied its ecological niche with remarkable effectiveness, that had shaped the behavior and possibly the cognitive evolution of the lineage that would eventually become us, that species ceased to exist. Its unique evolutionary heritage, the accumulated genetic and behavioral adaptations of millions of years of primate evolution, were lost. The world became poorer in biodiversity, even if our own lineage benefited from the reduction in competitive pressure. We live in a world that tends to tell evolutionary history as a story of progress, as a narrative of improvement, sophistication, and ultimately human triumph, and in some meaningful senses, it is a story of progress. The cognitive and behavioral capabilities of modern humans are genuinely extraordinary by any comparative biological standard. Our technology, our social organization, our cultural complexity, these are real achievements built on real foundations of evolutionary change. But the narrative of progress obscures something important, that our success has always come at a cost to other species, and that the trajectory of human ecological expansion has, from the very beginning, been a trajectory of competitive displacement and ecological simplification. Dinopithecus was probably not the only species that was negatively affected by the rise of early Homo. The broader pattern of large primate extinction in Africa during the late Plio-Pleistocene involved multiple species, and while climate change was certainly a significant contributing factor, the growing ecological capability of early Homo almost certainly played a role in many of these extinctions as well. The world that Homo erectus inherited as it spread out of Africa was already a world that had been shaped, in part, by the competitive dominance of the Homo lineage. And the world we inhabit today, with its dramatically reduced biodiversity of large primates and its extraordinary human ecological dominance, is the end product of a process that began in the rocky landscapes of early South Africa, in the competitive encounters between small, bipedal hominins and the giant baboon troops that challenged them at every water source and every sleeping site. This is not a reason for guilt or for self-flagellation. It is, however, a reason for humility. And it is a reason to take seriously the story of Dinopithecus, not as a curiosity, not as a prehistoric oddity, but as a genuinely important chapter in our own history. These animals were part of what made us what we are. They deserved better than to simply disappear. And the least we can do, millions of years later, is to tell their story with the seriousness and the care it deserves. The legacy of the competitive encounter between early hominins and Dinopithecus is visible, if you know where to look, in the behavioral ecology of modern humans. The patterns of vigilance and caution that characterize human behavior in unfamiliar environments, the automatic scanning of the horizon, the heightened alertness in enclosed or visually limited spaces, the discomfort of having unknown others at one's back, the rapid assessment of the size and apparent capability of other social groups, these are not cultural inventions. They are deep behavioral dispositions, shaped by millions of years of selection in exactly the kind of environment we have been describing. The early Plio-Pleistocene South African landscape was, in a very real sense, the environment in which the basic behavioral architecture of human vigilance and social assessment was forged. And Dinopithecus, along with the leopards, the hyenas, and the other powerful members of that community, was one of the forces that forged it. Modern humans are, by the standards of most large mammals, extraordinarily risk-averse in social contexts involving unknown others. We assess the size of strangers, their apparent emotional state, their group affiliation, and their behavioral intentions with a speed and accuracy that goes far beyond what conscious deliberation can explain. This rapid, automatic social assessment is the product of a neural system that evolved to make exactly these kinds of judgments quickly and accurately in situations where getting it wrong could have immediate fatal consequences. The situation of a hominin group encountering a Dinopithecus troop at a contested water source, needing to rapidly assess the troop's size, apparent mood, and likely response to the hominin group's presence, is precisely the kind of situation that would have driven the evolution of this rapid social assessment capability. We carry this ancient assessment system with us into every social interaction of modern life. It operates in boardrooms and shopping markets and family gatherings, still running the same ancient algorithms that were shaped in the Dolomite Hills of early South Africa, still assessing size and number and mood and intent with the same urgency that a small hominin group would have applied to the problem of a large Dinopithecus troop at the water's edge. The context has changed entirely. The underlying neural machinery has not. The question of how early hominins communicated about threats like Dinopithecus, how they shared information within their groups about the presence, location, and behavior of competing species, is one of the most fascinating and most difficult questions in the study of early human evolution. We know that early hominins had some form of social communication more sophisticated than what we observe in most non-human primates, because the behavioral evidence for group coordination, strategic resource use, and accumulated technological knowledge all require communication systems capable of transmitting relatively specific and complex information. But the nature of that communication, how it worked, what forms it took, how it compared to modern human language, is almost entirely beyond the reach of the physical fossil record. What we can reconstruct, through inference from comparative primate communication research and from the cognitive demands of early hominin ecology, is some sense of what that communication needed to be able to do. Needed to be able to convey information about the location and identity of specific other groups, not just that there was danger somewhere in a general sense, but that there was a specific Dinopithecus troop of known identity and behavioral history present at a specific location relative to the speaker's position. It needed to be able to convey temporal information, not just that the troop is there, but that the troop was there yesterday and has probably moved in a particular direction. It needed to be able to convey recommendations for action. Move this way, not that way, stay here, go now. And it needed to be able to do all of this rapidly and clearly enough that the information could actually change the behavior of other group members in time to be useful. This is a communicative system, significantly more powerful than anything documented in modern non-human primates, though perhaps not as fully developed as modern human language. It represents an intermediate stage in the evolution of language, a proto-linguistic communication system capable of specific reference and temporal displacement, but perhaps lacking some of the full syntactic complexity and open-ended generativity of modern language. The development of this system, driven in part by the communicative demands of navigating a competitive landscape populated by species like Dinopithecus, was one of the most significant steps in the long evolutionary journey toward modern human language. Language, in other words, was not invented for poetry or philosophy or storytelling, though it eventually became capable of all of these things. It was shaped in its earliest stages by the need to share critical survival information about large, dangerous neighbors, by the need to say in whatever the early Homo equivalent of words was, something like, "The giant baboons are at the north water source. They were aggressive yesterday. Let us go to the east instead." That kind of specific, actionable, temporally displaced information sharing was the communicative challenge that drove the earliest stages of language evolution. And Dinopithecus, as one of the most significant and most behaviorally complex of those large, dangerous neighbors, was one of the primary drivers of that demand. As we approach the final sections of our documentary, it is worth considering the broader intellectual context within which the study of Dinopithecus sits, the scientific traditions and methodological approaches that have allowed us to reconstruct as much as we have about this remarkable animal, and the limitations that remain, likely permanently, on how much we can ever know. Paleontology is, at its best, a science of disciplined imagination. The data, the fossils themselves, the stratigraphy of the deposits they come from, the associated fauna and flora provide the framework. But the reconstruction of living biology from dead remains requires a willingness to reason carefully from limited evidence to plausible inference, always making explicit the difference between what is directly documented and what is inferred, always remaining open to revision as new evidence emerges. For Dinopithecus, the ratio of inference to direct documentation is high. We know its skull morphology, we know its tooth structure, and from where patterns and isotopic analysis, something of its diet. We know when and approximately where it lived. We know its taxonomic relationship to modern baboons and to other fossil cercopithecids. And from all of this, combined with our knowledge of modern baboon ecology and behavior, we have constructed a picture of Dinopithecus that is, we believe, broadly accurate in its main outlines, even if it is inevitably missing the details that only a complete postcranial skeleton and behavioral observations could provide. What would change our picture most dramatically, postcranial material, shoulder and pelvic girdle, that would allow direct reconstruction of locomotor proportions. Such material would tell us how Dinopithecus moved. Motor adaptations were more like terrestrial baboons or more specialized in some way, and would allow more precise estimates of body mass than the cranial material alone can provide. It would also potentially inform our understanding of sexual dimorphism, the degree of size difference between males and females, which has important implications for reconstructing social structure and competitive behavior. The discovery of such material is not impossible. Cave sites in South Africa are still being actively excavated, and new fossil material is discovered regularly. The Drimmelen Cave complex, for example, has yielded remarkable new hominin material in recent years that has significantly changed our understanding of early Homo and Paranthropus diversity in the region. There is no reason in principle why additional Dinopithecus material, including postcranial elements, could not be found in ongoing or future excavations. The fossil record is not complete. It is a work in progress, and each new discovery has the potential to significantly revise what we think we know. The relationship between scientific uncertainty and public understanding is a challenge that any documentary about paleontology must navigate carefully. The temptation when presenting a story like the story of Dinopithecus is to smooth over the uncertainties, to present the inferences as facts, as certainties, the plausible scenarios as established history. This is a temptation to be resisted because the uncertainties are not embarrassments to be hidden. They are genuine and important features of the scientific landscape, and honestly communicating them is part of what it means to take the science seriously. What we know for certain about Dinopithecus is this: there was a large, baboon-like primate living in South Africa during the early Plio-Pleistocene, with a skull morphology and dental structure indicating substantial body size and a dietary strategy consistent with omnivorous generalism. It lived in temporal and spatial overlap with multiple hominin species. It was almost certainly socially complex and capable of collective behavior. It disappeared from the fossil record around 1.5 million years ago. What we infer with reasonable confidence but not certainty. It lived in social groups similar in basic structure to modern baboon troops. It was primarily associated with woodland and forest edge habitats. Its body mass was substantially greater than that of modern baboons. It competed with early hominins for food, water, and sleeping sites. Its presence created ecological pressure that influenced early hominin behavior and, over evolutionary timescales, contributed to the development of the cognitive and behavioral traits that distinguish early Homo from earlier hominins. What we speculate, with less certainty but with ecological plausibility, its troops communicated using vocalizations that early hominins monitored and responded to. Its declining population sizes in the late Plio-Pleistocene combined effects of habitat loss and increasing hominin competitive capability. Its extinction was partly a consequence of the same human evolutionary trajectory that its own competitive presence had helped to create. This is the full picture: certain foundations, reasonable inferences, and speculative extensions. All three are presented here, clearly labeled, because that is the honest way to tell this story. The early South African landscape that we have been describing throughout this documentary was not just the setting for the hominin-Dinopithecus interaction. It was, in the fullest sense, the birthplace of human consciousness as we understand it, the environment in which the biological foundations of thought, language, social intelligence, and technological creativity were laid down. Every species that inhabited that landscape, every ecological challenge that environment presented, every competitive encounter that required rapid assessment and strategic response, all of these contributed, in ways large and small, to the sculpting of the neural machinery that eventually produced Homo sapiens. Dinopithecus was one contributor among many, but it was a significant one, powerful, persistent, and cognitively demanding in exactly the ways that would have driven the most consequential aspects of early human cognitive evolution. We tend to celebrate human intelligence as an achievement, which it is. We tend to attribute it to the creativity and capability of our own lineage, which is also true. But we rarely acknowledge the role of the competitors, the predators, the environmental challenges that created the selection pressure for that intelligence in the first place. Intelligence is not free. It is metabolically expensive, developmentally demanding, and socially complex in its maintenance. It would not have evolved, and certainly would not have expanded to the extraordinary degree it has in our lineage, without selection pressure powerful enough to justify the cost. Dinopithecus, along with the leopards and the hyenas and the saber-toothed cats and the drought cycles and the changing habitats and the competing hominin species, was part of the pressure that made that intelligence worth paying for. This is perhaps the most profound way in which the story of Dinopithecus is the story of us. Not because we are descended from it, we are not. Not because it was our friend or our enemy in any sense meaningful beyond the purely ecological. But because it was part of the crucible. It was part of what the universe, in its entirely impersonal and indifferent way, applied to the raw material of our ancestors to produce something genuinely new in the history of life on this planet. The giant baboon haunted our ancestors, and in doing so, it helped make them human. The sites of the cradle of humankind draw visitors and researchers from around the world every year, and for good reason. Walking through the Sterkfontein Valley, looking across the Dolomite Hills with their cave systems and rocky outcroppings, it is possible, if you make the imaginative effort, to see the landscape almost as it might have looked 2.5 million years ago. The hills are still there. The caves are still there, deeper and more extensively explored than they have ever been, but structurally the same features that they always were. The basic geological architecture of the landscape, the ridges and valleys and cave-pocked hillsides, would have been recognizable to the hominins and to the Dinopithecus troops that navigated it millions of years ago. What is gone, of course, is the life. The extraordinary diversity of Plio-Pleistocene fauna, the giant primates, the saber-toothed cats, the enormous hyenas, the diverse antelope fauna, the great variety of birds and reptiles, has been replaced by the much diminished biodiversity of the modern era. Many of those Plio-Pleistocene species survived into the Pleistocene, and even in some cases into the Holocene before ultimately succumbing to the combination of climate change and human hunting pressure that has characterized the post-Homo sapiens world. But the full richness of that early community, the extraordinary density of large mammals, the diversity of primate forms, the complex web of competitive and predatory interactions, is gone, and it will not return. What remains is the fossil record, fragmentary, biased, and incomplete, but also irreplaceable and extraordinary in what it reveals. And what remains is the work of the scientists and researchers who spend their careers extracting meaning from that record, the paleontologists who excavate, the taphonomists who interpret depositional processes, the isotope geochemists who reconstruct ancient diets and environments, the primatologists whose behavioral observations of living species inform our understanding of extinct ones. And the evolutionary biologists who integrate all of these data streams into coherent narratives about how and why the living world has changed through time. It is from that collective scientific enterprise that the story of Dinopithecus has been recovered, piece by piece, inference by inference, always incomplete, always provisional, but always revealing something real and important about the world that produced us. What does the story of Dinopithecus ultimately mean for how we understand ourselves? This is the question that all of paleontology eventually arrives at, however circuitously. The study of extinct species is always, at some level, the study of the context that produced us, of the evolutionary environment that shaped the lineage we belong to, of the competitive and ecological forces that drove the adaptations we now carry. Dinopithecus is a particularly instructive example because its relationship to our own lineage was not one of ancestry. It was not our grandfather or our cousin in a sense. It was our competitor. And that competitive relationship, sustained over hundreds of thousands of years, was one of the significant forces shaping what we became. This tells us something important about the nature of evolution that is easy to miss when we focus only on adaptation to physical environments. We evolved not just in response to climate, terrain, and food availability. We evolved in response to each other, to the other species in our communities, and especially to the most cognitively and socially complex of those species. The social brain is not just a brain adapted for managing relationships within our own species. It is a brain adapted for managing relationships with a wide range of socially complex other species that had their own social structures, their own behavioral strategies, their own competitive agendas. Dinopithecus was one of the most important of those others, at least in the early South African context, and the demands it placed on early hominin social intelligence were real and significant. Also learn something from the Dinopithecus story about the contingency of evolutionary success. Dinopithecus was, by any objective assessment, an extraordinarily successful species. It survived for over 1 million years in a highly competitive environment. It was large, powerful, socially sophisticated, and ecologically flexible. By any standard measure of evolutionary fitness, it was a winner until it wasn't. Its extinction was not the result of some fundamental inadequacy. It was the result of circumstances, the combination of climate change and an increasingly capable competitor that it had no way to anticipate or prepare for. There was nothing Dinopithecus could have done differently, within the constraints of its biology and its evolutionary history, that would clearly have saved it from extinction. Our own success, similarly, should not be mistaken for destiny. We are here because our ancestors made it through the bottleneck, because the margins held, because the circumstances that were eliminating other species were, in our case, selecting for the traits that allowed survival. That is an extraordinary stroke of luck as much as an achievement of design. The world was under no obligation to produce us. It could as easily have produced a world in which Dinopithecus survived and early Homo went extinct, a world in which the evolutionary experiment of our lineage simply did not work out. We exist in the particular world where it did work out, but we should hold that fact with humility, remembering that the world is full of the fossils of extraordinary species that were as successful as we are now, right up until they were not. As we draw toward the close of this documentary, it is worth spending a final moment with the animal itself, with Dinopithecus as a living creature rather than a fossil specimen or an ecological concept. Behind all of the scientific analysis, all of the ecological modeling, all of the inferential reconstruction, there was a real animal. There were real Dinopithecus individuals that were born into troops, that grew and competed for social rank, that formed relationships and alliances, that experienced fear and aggression and comfort and satisfaction, that raised young, that aged, and that died. They experienced the world around them with whatever subjectivity their neural architecture afforded them, which was certainly more than nothing and may have been more than we typically credit. They would have experienced the early South African landscape with extraordinary sensory richness, the smells of the woodland in different seasons, the sounds of the troop around them and the sounds of the broader community beyond, the feel of rocky surface, the taste of fruit and roots and animal protein, the warmth of social contact. They would have had social relationships of real complexity and real emotional texture, bonds between mothers and offspring that extended throughout life, male alliances and rivalries, the complicated social navigation of a primate hierarchy that was as real and as demanding to them as any human social environment is to us. They were not monsters. They were not demons. They were primates, our extended evolutionary family, shaped by the same fundamental biological heritage that shaped us, living their lives with the same basic imperatives of survival and reproduction that govern all living things. The fact that they were competitors of our ancestors does not make them adversaries in any morally meaningful sense. It makes them participants in the same great ecological drama, the drama of life competing with life, of evolution proceeding through the mechanisms of differential survival and reproduction, of a planet generating extraordinary diversity and then, through the same mechanisms, reducing that diversity as circumstances change. Dinopithecus played its part in that drama. It played it well for a very long time. And it left its mark on the history of life on this planet, most significantly, and most irrevocably, in the shape and capability of the brains of the creatures that outlasted it. The final chapter of the Dinopithecus story is, in a sense, also the opening chapter of the modern human story. As the giant baboon retreated from the South African landscape, its populations shrinking, its range contracting, its ecological presence diminishing, early Homo was expanding. Moving into new territories, developing new technologies, building more complex social structures, and beginning the long process of becoming the ecological force that would eventually transform every landscape on the planet. The transition was not sudden. It was gradual and overlapping, probably invisible at the scale of any individual lifetime. But it was real and it was directional, and it led through many subsequent chapters of evolutionary and cultural change to the world we live in today. In that world, there are no Dinopithecus troops to track and avoid. There are no giant baboons at the water source, no massive primates occupying the best sleeping sites, no collective ridge above announcing a leopard in the vegetation below. The competitive landscape that shaped our deepest behavioral dispositions is gone, replaced by a world so transformed by our own activity that the selection pressures of the Plio-Pleistocene feel impossibly remote. And yet we carry the legacy of that landscape within us, in our social vigilance, our rapid threat assessment, our capacity for coalition building and strategic coordination, our extraordinary ability to model the intentions and capabilities of other social actors. These traits, shaped in part by millions of years of primate competition in the early African landscape, are as present and as functional in us today as they ever were. The giant baboon that haunted our ancestors is gone, but its shadow, cast by the long light of evolutionary time, still falls across everything we are. This has been the story of Dinopithecus, one of the most powerful, most socially sophisticated, and most ecological animals in the world. A creature whose fossils are sparse and whose partly mysterious, but whose ecological importance are as clear and as significant as any chapter in the long planet. We have followed it through existence in the woodlands of early. We have examined the competitive and helped to shape. We have traced the environmental changes that ultimately contributed to its extinction. We have attempted throughout to understand what this animal's life and death mean for our understanding of ourselves, of what we are, where we came from, and what the real story of human like when we strip away the triumphalist honestly at the evidence. The evidence tells us that we are survivors, not because we were destined to survive, but because, generation after generation, our ancestors were smart enough and adaptable enough and lucky enough to make it through. The evidence tells us that the world that produced us was extraordinary in its richness and its complexity, and that we are diminished by every loss of species and biodiversity that our own success has caused. And the evidence tells us that Dinopithecus, the giant baboon, the haunter of our ancestors, the inadvertent architect of some of our most distinctive cognitive capabilities, deserves to be remembered, studied, and understood, not as a monster, not as a curiosity, but as a genuine and important part of the story of what it took to become human. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment below and let us know where you are watching this video and what time it is where you are. Subscribe to the channel for future documentaries, because there are many more extraordinary stories from the deep past waiting to be told, stories of the creatures that shared the world with our ancestors, that shaped them, that challenged them, and that ultimately helped to make them what they are. The past is deeper and stranger and more magnificent than we usually imagine. The story of us. Before we begin, take a moment to drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the